Behind the most meticulously crafted and diabolical plans lie minds so thoroughly corrupted that the unfiltered evidence of their crimes is far too graphic for this platform's guidelines to ever show you. Today, we step into the shadows of 10 female killers whose calculated acts of malice reveal a chilling, methodical capacity for cruelty that defies all human comprehension. If you enjoy investigations, you can subscribe to the channel, and I will try to release interesting investigations as often as possible. Travis Alexander was a 30-year-old motivational speaker and salesman for prepaid legal services, living a devout Mormon lifestyle in a quiet, prosperous suburb of Mesa, Arizona, surrounded by a close-knit circle of friends who deeply admired his boundless charisma and professional drive. In September of 2006, while attending a crowded company convention in Las Vegas, Nevada, he crossed paths with a 26-year-old aspiring photographer named Jodi Arias, sparking an intense, immediate physical connection that quickly evolved into a highly passionate, long-distance relationship. For a significant period of time, their dynamic appeared entirely normal to outside observers, marked by frequent travel between his Arizona home and her residence in California, filled with the typical milestones, shared photography sessions, and public displays of a blossoming romance. However, beneath the polished veneer of their shared religious aspirations and affectionate electronic correspondence, the foundation of their relationship was fundamentally unstable, built on a stark contrast between Travis's desire for casual, non-committal companionship and Jodi's rapidly escalating, obsessive psychological attachment. As the subsequent months progressed, Travis attempted to establish firm emotional boundaries and officially ended their formal courtship in the summer of 2007, hoping to safely transition their dynamic into an amicable, albeit complicated, platonic friendship. Despite this official breakup, the two remained deeply entangled in a volatile, highly secretive physical relationship, a toxic dynamic that Jodi aggressively nurtured, while simultaneously embedding herself deeper into the private corners of his personal life. She began exhibiting severe stalking behaviors, going so far as to illicitly hack into his social media and email accounts, secretly slash his car tires in moments of extreme jealousy, and covertly monitor his interactions with other women from a distance. Travis frequently confided in his closest confidants that he felt increasingly suffocated and genuinely fearful of Jodi's unpredictable, erratic behavior, distinctly describing her as an obsessed individual who violently refused to accept the concrete reality of their severed ties. Seeking to finalize his independence, he began making deliberate plans to move forward with his life, scheduling a company-sponsored trip to Cancun, Mexico, with another female companion, a decision that effectively signaled the absolute, undeniable end of his availability to Jodi. This impending trip and his definitive rejection served as the quiet, unseen catalyst for what was to come, transforming a fractured, dying romance into a dark breeding ground for a meticulously calculated, deeply sinister tragedy. The sunny, prosperous environment of Travis's Mesa home, once a symbol of his hard-earned success and social standing, was entirely oblivious to the dark, premeditated intentions that were actively converging upon it in the early days of June 2008. The fragile illusion of suburban normalcy was permanently shattered on the evening of June 9, 2008, when deeply concerned friends, who had not heard from Travis for several days and noted his highly unusual absence at crucial business meetings, decided to physically visit his Mesa residence to check on his well-being. Upon entering the seemingly undisturbed, quiet house, they were immediately struck by a profound, unnatural silence that permeated the lower levels, followed almost instantly by the overwhelming, metallic scent of biological decay that hung heavy in the warm, stagnant air of the main hallway. As they cautiously navigated the familiar, meticulously decorated layout of the home, their growing, unspoken apprehension rapidly turned into absolute, paralyzing horror when they reached the master bathroom suite on the upper floor. This private, secluded space had been violently transformed into a chaotic scene of unimaginable carnage, completely contradicting the pristine order of the rest of the residence. Travis Alexander's decomposing body was discovered heavily slumped on the tiled floor of his glass-enclosed shower, His physical form, having been subjected to a level of extreme violence that deeply shocked even the seasoned Mesa police detectives, who arrived shortly after the frantic, emotional 911 call. The crime scene was an immediate, grotesque tableau of overkill, revealing through initial inspection that Travis had suffered 29 distinct, deep stab wounds scattered across his upper back, torso, and heart. Alongside these fatal punctures, medical examiners noted severe defensive lacerations on his hands and fingers, indicating a desperate, agonizing, and prolonged physical struggle for survival against a highly motivated attacker. Furthermore, his throat had been slashed from ear to ear with such extreme, deliberate, and sustained force that the victim was nearly decapitated in the process. A subsequent forensic examination would reveal a final, terrifying detail: a point-blank gunshot wound to his right forehead, administered with a .25 caliber weapon, effectively ensuring his death after the brutal stabbing had concluded. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the physical attack stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the quiet, secure nature of the gated neighborhood, instantly dispelling any preliminary law enforcement theories of a random burglary or a home invasion gone wrong. Blood had pooled heavily on the bathroom tiles, streaked aggressively down the painted walls, and left a morbid, distinct trail leading from the dual vanity sink directly to the shower enclosure. This physical evidence painted a grim, incontrovertible picture of the victim's final, desperate moments as he tried in vain to escape his assailant's relentless pursuit. The discovery of the mutilated body served as the irrevocable point of no return for the local investigation, instantly shifting the departmental focus from a routine missing person inquiry to a highly complex, high-stakes homicide case. It was within the confines of this blood-soaked bathroom that investigators unknowingly took their very first steps into a labyrinthine narrative of extreme deception, setting the stage for a relentless pursuit of empirical truth. As the Mesa Police Department meticulously processed the blood-stained crime scene for trace evidence, a highly critical, case-altering breakthrough emerged from an incredibly unlikely source. A severely damaged Sony digital camera discovered submerged in a load of damp laundry at the bottom of Travis's washing machine. Highly trained forensic analysts at the Regional State Crime Laboratory performed a painstaking, highly technical data recovery process on the corrupted memory card, ultimately extracting a deleted sequence of time-stamped photographs. These salvaged digital files provided an incontrovertible, chilling visual timeline of the afternoon of June 4, 2008, establishing a concrete record of the events leading directly up to the homicide. The recovered images initially depicted a seemingly consensual, highly intimate encounter between Travis and Jodi Arias, followed by mundane, seemingly innocent photographs of Travis sitting in the shower under the running water. However, the digital sequence took a rapid, horrifying turn toward violence, with the final, inadvertently captured photos documenting a chaotic, bloody blur of rapid motion. These final images displayed Travis bleeding profusely from unseen wounds and attempting to defend himself against a violent attacker, capturing the exact moments his life was actively being taken from him. One specific, incredibly chilling image within this final sequence revealed the distinct foot and denim pant leg of the assailant, an article of clothing that perfectly matched the physical profile and known wardrobe of Jodi Arias. Confronted with the overwhelming, mathematical suspicion generated by this digital evidence and her known obsession with the victim, investigators brought Arias in for formal questioning, triggering a prolonged psychological cat and mouse game defined by her continuous, pathological fabrication of events. Initially, Arias projected an aura of profound grief and unwavering innocence, looking directly into the police interrogation camera and vehemently denying that she had even been in the state of Arizona during the month of June, asserting she was on a lengthy, uninterrupted road trip to Utah. When seasoned detectives systematically dismantled this primary alibi by presenting concrete physical evidence of her rental car's presence in Mesa, combined with the undeniable digital photographs placing her at the exact scene of the crime, she seamlessly and calmly transitioned to a second, highly elaborate narrative. She tearfully recounted a completely fabricated, dramatic story involving two masked, violent intruders who had allegedly broken into the home, brutally murdered Travis before her terrified eyes, and subsequently threatened her into permanent silence. Investigators, refusing to accept this baseless narrative, continued to dig deeper into her financial and physical actions preceding the murder, uncovering a highly premeditated, undeniable trail of dark preparation. This investigative trail proved she had deliberately rented a vehicle far from her home in California, intentionally left her primary mobile phone behind to completely avoid digital GPS tracking, and purchased a third gasoline can to avoid leaving financial footprints at local gas stations during her cross-country drive. Every single lie she constructed was methodically unraveled by the relentless, objective accumulation of empirical data, transforming the investigation from a search for a suspect into an airtight documentation of a meticulously planned execution. The judicial reckoning for these crimes culminated in a highly publicized, deeply polarizing criminal trial that began in January 2013, functioning as the ultimate public battleground, where the prosecution sought to permanently dismantle the complex architecture of lies that Arias had constructed. Recognizing the absolute futility of her previous intruder narratives in the face of insurmountable, objective forensic evidence, the defense team executed a dramatic, high-risk legal pivot. They formally admitted to the court that Arias had indeed killed Travis Alexander, but forcefully asserted that the horrific, bloody violence was a legally justifiable act of self-defense against a chronically abusive and deeply violent partner. Arias herself took the witness stand for an unprecedented and grueling 18 days, delivering a marathon, highly controlled testimony filled with uncorroborated allegations of severe physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Throughout this prolonged testimony, she constantly attempted to reframe her public image, positioning herself as a severely traumatized, battered victim who finally snapped during a terrifying, life-threatening physical altercation. However, the prosecution systematically and ruthlessly dismantled this final, desperate facade by cross-examining her with clinical, objective precision, exposing the glaring logistical contradictions in her timeline. The state highlighted the complete, absolute lack of documented medical or police reports corroborating any history of domestic abuse, while simultaneously emphasizing her long, proven history of pathological deception and stalking behavior. The true climax of the legal proceedings centered heavily on the irrefutable, scientific forensic evidence, specifically the highly technical testimony of seasoned medical examiners and blood spatter analysts. These forensic experts mathematically and physically proved that the documented sequence of fatal injuries, the defensive wounds on the hands, the massive, debilitating trauma to the throat, and the final gunshot to the head, could not possibly align with a spontaneous, frantic act of self-defense. The prosecution successfully painted a vivid, chilling, and fact-based portrait of first-degree premeditation, detailing exactly how Arias had covertly traveled across state lines with a stolen, loaded weapon and a rented car. They demonstrated how she engaged in sexual intimacy specifically to render her victim completely vulnerable, and then executed a surprise, sustained, and highly organized attack with overwhelming, disproportionate physical force. The dramatic peak of the trial was ultimately reached during the prosecution's closing arguments, when the state visually and logically bound the chronological timeline of the recovered digital photographs directly to the physical blood evidence found in the bathroom. This masterclass in evidentiary presentation left the jury with the undeniable, horrific reality of a cold, calculated slaughter, completely stripping away any lingering illusions regarding her innocence, justification, or victimization. On May 8, 2013, following several days of intense, closed-door deliberation, the jury returned a definitive and resounding verdict, formally finding Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. This verdict served as a complete, legal rejection of her multifaceted, evolving claims of self-defense and prolonged domestic abuse, firmly establishing her actions as cold-blooded, calculated homicide. Despite the swift conviction, the subsequent penalty phase of the trial proved to be a highly protracted, emotionally exhausting, and legally complex process for all parties involved. Two entirely separate juries ultimately failed to reach a unanimous consensus on whether to legally impose the death penalty, resulting in deadlocked outcomes that prolonged the family's suffering. Consequently, the ultimate, heavy responsibility for final sentencing fell directly to the presiding judicial judge who, on April 13, 2015, handed down a definitive sentence of natural life in state prison without the absolute possibility of parole. This strict sentencing mandate ensured that Arias would remain permanently removed from civilized society, effectively ending her capacity to manipulate or harm others outside of a controlled institutional environment. She was subsequently transferred to the secure confines of the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, where she continues to serve her life sentence under stringent maximum security protocols. Over the ensuing years, her numerous, highly technical legal appeals have been systematically and repeatedly denied by higher state appellate courts, solidifying the permanence of her initial conviction and sentence. The Alexander family, having endured years of grueling, highly publicized legal proceedings and the relentless public assassination of Travis's character by the defense, expressed a solemn, quiet relief at the finality of the sentence. They found a small measure of true justice in the cold, unyielding reality of her permanent, lifelong incarceration. Knowing she would never again draw a breath as a free citizen, the physical residence in Mesa, once the vibrant site of immense professional potential and ultimately the stage for horrific violence, was eventually cleaned and sold, standing today as a quiet, physical remnant of a life violently interrupted by an obsessive, calculating intruder. The exhaustive, factual documentation of this specific case serves as a stark procedural record of how meticulous forensic investigation can systematically tear down even the most complex, adaptable architectures of deception crafted by a deeply determined perpetrator. While the Arizona judicial system successfully neutralized the immediate threat posed by Arias through rigorous evidentiary analysis and strict judicial procedure, she is far from the only individual who arrogantly believed they could construct a flawless, impenetrable narrative to conceal a premeditated execution. In fact, moving across the country from the deserts of Arizona to the warm coastal suburbs of Florida, investigators would soon encounter another individual whose chillingly calm orchestration of a murder plot was captured not just in the bloody aftermath of violence, but in the very process of its sinister, documented negotiation. Michael Dippolito was a convicted fill-on trying to rebuild his life, finding success in real estate and establishing a comfortable, seemingly idyllic life in the sun-drenched, affluent community of Boynton Beach, Florida. In October 2008, he crossed paths with Dalia Mohammed, an escort who quickly captivated him, leading to a whirlwind romance that culminated in a hasty marriage just a few days after his divorce from his previous wife was legally finalized. To outside observers and neighbors in their quiet residential complex, the newlywed couple projected an image of absolute, undisturbed domestic bliss. Complete with a beautiful townhouse and a lavish lifestyle fueled by Michael's financial resources and his intense, unconditional devotion to his new bride. Dalia, however, harbored dark, deeply concealed ulterior motives that stood in stark contrast to the loving, supportive facade she meticulously maintained during their public outings and social interactions. Shortly after the ink dried on their marriage certificate, she began orchestrating a complex, insidious campaign to systematically strip Michael of his assets, secretly convincing him to transfer the deed of their shared townhouse entirely into her name, under the guise of protecting it from potential legal liabilities tied to his past probation status. Simultaneously, she was actively working to sabotage his strict probation terms, covertly planting illegal narcotics in his vehicle, and anonymously tipping off local law enforcement in a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to send him back to a state penitentiary for an extended period. When these initial, indirect methods of eliminating her husband from her life failed to yield the immediate results she desired, her deceptive strategies escalated into a far more sinister, permanent solution. She began actively seeking a direct, violent intervention, casually reaching out to former acquaintances within the criminal underworld to explicitly inquire about the logistical process of hiring a professional assassin to definitively sever her marital ties. The sunny, vibrant atmosphere of their Florida neighborhood remained completely oblivious to the lethal conspiracy gestating within its borders. As Dalia ruthlessly transitioned from a manipulative spouse seeking financial ruin into a highly determined individual actively plotting a premeditated, cold-blooded execution. This calculated pivot from financial exploitation to outright murder fundamentally defined the terrifying duality of her character, setting the stage for a dramatic, high-stakes collision between her sociopathic ambitions and the unwavering, procedural vigilance of local law enforcement. The carefully constructed illusion of Dalia Dippolito's perfect suburban existence was violently, publicly shattered on the humid morning of August 5, 2009, when she returned from a routine trip to the local gymnasium to find her residential street heavily barricaded by a massive, highly coordinated police presence. Yellow crime scene tape aggressively cordoned off the immediate perimeter of her townhouse, while numerous marked patrol vehicles, stern-faced uniformed officers, and forensic technicians actively swarmed the property, creating an atmosphere of intense, palpable chaos. As Dalia cautiously approached the physical boundary of the police line, she was immediately intercepted by a visibly somber Boynton Beach police sergeant who gently pulled her aside to deliver the devastating, life-altering news that her husband, Michael, had been the victim of a fatal, targeted shooting inside their shared home. Upon hearing this horrific proclamation, Dalia immediately launched into a spectacular, highly theatrical display of profound grief, collapsing heavily against the officer's chest, wailing inconsolably and shedding copious, seemingly authentic tears for the benefit of the surrounding neighborhood and the dash cam recording the interaction. She vehemently demanded to see her husband's body, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation as she portrayed the devastating, sudden reality of a deeply traumatized, newly widowed wife whose entire world had just been inexplicably destroyed by a random act of brutal violence. This dramatic public performance, however, was entirely predicated on a fundamental, colossal deception, as the sprawling crime scene she was mourning over was, in absolute reality, a meticulously orchestrated, highly elaborate theatrical production directed by the Boynton Beach Police Department. The officers, forensic specialists, and the grim narrative of Michael's demise were all crucial, carefully synchronized components of a complex, proactive sting operation specifically designed to safely draw Dalia into the open and confirm her complicity in the murder plot. This pivotal moment of stage tragedy served as the true inciting incident of the public narrative, representing the exact point where Dalia's private, lethal machinations violently collided with the uncompromising, objective reality of a criminal investigation. She was entirely unaware that the law enforcement personnel comforting her were intimately familiar with the dark, premeditated intentions she harbored, possessing irrefutable, documented knowledge of the exact mechanism she had chosen to orchestrate this very outcome. As she was gently escorted away from the fabricated crime scene and transported to the local police precinct under the guise of providing a routine, grieving widow's statement, the investigation crossed a critical threshold, transitioning seamlessly from a covert, intelligence gathering operation into a direct, high-stakes psychological confrontation. The astonishing reality behind the staged crime scene was deeply rooted in a highly complex, multi-layered investigation that had been covertly initiated several days prior, triggered by a highly credible, urgent tip from one of Dalia's former lovers, Mohammed Shihada. Shihada had bravely approached the local authorities, providing them with chilling, undeniable intelligence that Dalia was actively, persistently soliciting his assistance to locate and hire a professional hitman willing to murder her husband for a predetermined financial sum. Recognizing the imminent, life-threatening danger to Michael Dippolito, the Boynton Beach Police Department swiftly mobilized, setting up a highly sophisticated undercover sting operation and enlisting the services of a seasoned undercover narcotics officer named Witty Jean to convincingly portray the role of the ruthless, contracted assassin. The investigative climax of this covert operation occurred inside the claustrophobic confines of a seemingly unremarkable, heavily wired vehicle parked outside a local pharmacy, where Dalia confidently entered to finalize the fatal, transactional details with the man she believed was a seasoned killer. Covered audio and video recording equipment flawlessly captured every chilling, highly incriminating second of their interaction, documenting Dalia's shockingly calm, completely remorseless demeanor as she coldly discussed the absolute necessity of her husband's violent death. With chilling detachment, she explicitly directed the undercover officer to ensure that Michael was shot directly in the head to guarantee a fatal outcome, handing over a cash down payment and a comprehensive dossier containing photographs, daily schedules, and the physical layout of their townhouse. When the undercover officer deliberately offered her a final, clear opportunity to back out of the lethal arrangement, explicitly warning her that the action was permanent and irreversible, Dalia responded with a profound, terrifying lack of hesitation, stating she was absolutely 5,000% sure she wanted the execution carried out. These pristine, irrefutable recordings fundamentally dismantled any potential future claims of coercion or misunderstanding, providing prosecutors with an airtight, objective window into the dark, highly calculated mechanics of a premeditated murder for hire plot. Upon securing this damning, incontrovertible evidence, the police immediately placed Michael into secure, protective custody, ensuring his physical safety while simultaneously coordinating the massive, highly publicized stage crime scene at the townhouse to complete the elaborate deception. As Dalia sat in the police interrogation room, actively weaving a web of lies about her supposedly perfect marriage and feigning absolute ignorance regarding anyone who would want to harm her husband, the detectives quietly prepared to present her with the objective, insurmountable truth of her own recorded words. The true, devastating climax of the investigation unfolded within the sterile, brightly lit confines of the police interrogation room, a psychological battleground where Dalia Dippolito arrogantly believed she was successfully manipulating seasoned detectives with her continued performance of a grieving, bewildered widow. The lead investigator, adopting a calm, measured tone that starkly contrasted with Dalia's manufactured hysterics, began to systematically, deliberately deconstruct her carefully fabricated narrative by introducing subtle, undeniable inconsistencies regarding her known whereabouts and recent communications. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically, becoming thick with an almost suffocating tension as the detective casually informed Dalia that they had, in fact, located a highly suspect individual who claimed to have intimate, detailed knowledge of the plot against her husband. The door to the interrogation room abruptly opened, and the meticulously constructed, sociopathic illusion Dalia had been living completely disintegrated when Officer Weddy Jean, the very man she had explicitly hired and paid to execute her husband just hours prior, walked into the room, dressed not as a ruthless hitman, but in his official, formal police attire. Dalia's physical reaction was instantaneous and profound, the blood visibly drained from her face, her eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing terror, and her previously fluent, deceptive rhetoric was instantly replaced by a stunned, incomprehensible silence. The sheer, monumental scale of the sting operation visibly crushed her, as she struggled to mentally process the complete failure of her deadly machinations. The final, fatal blow to her crumbling reality was delivered moments later when the door opened once again to reveal Michael Dippolito, entirely unharmed and staring down at the woman who had coldly, ruthlessly orchestrated his absolute destruction for sheer financial gain. Confronted simultaneously with the undeniable, breathing proof of her failure, and the undercover officer who held the recorded, irrefutable evidence of her murderous intentions, Dalia's initial response was a desperate, highly irrational attempt at continued denial, feigning complete ignorance regarding the situation. This desperate, final facade was swiftly, mercilessly eradicated when the detectives formally placed her under arrest, tightly securing the handcuffs around her wrists, while explicitly outlining the overwhelming, documented mountain of audio and video evidence against her. The interrogation room, initially a stage for her deceptive performance, had seamlessly transformed into a definitive, inescapable trap, capturing the exact, terrifying moment a predator realizes they have been entirely outmaneuvered by the relentless, objective pursuit of the truth. The subsequent legal trajectory of Dalia Dippolito's case proved to be a highly protracted, legally exhausting saga, marked by multiple, highly publicized trials and a relentless series of aggressive defense strategies aimed at discrediting the extensive, undeniable law enforcement sting operation. Her defense team repeatedly attempted to utilize a highly controversial entrapment defense, arguing that the Boynton Beach police had overstepped their jurisdictional boundaries and aggressively coerced a vulnerable woman into committing a crime she would not have otherwise pursued, a narrative completely contradicted by the pristine video recordings. Despite these aggressive, multifaceted legal maneuvers, the sheer, objective weight of the covertly recorded evidence, specifically her chilling declaration of being 5,000% sure, consistently proved entirely insurmountable for juries to legally ignore or logically dismiss. After years of complex legal wrangling, overturned convictions based on procedural technicalities, and exhaustive appellate court battles, Dalia Dippolito was finally, definitively convicted of solicitation to commit first-degree murder in 2017, permanently cementing her status as a calculated, dangerous felon. The presiding judicial authority, noting the exceptionally cold, premeditated nature of the crime and her absolute, documented lack of genuine remorse, sentenced her to a stringent 16 years in a state correctional facility, ensuring a significant deprivation of her liberty. She currently resides within the secure, highly monitored confines of the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, her ambitious, murderous plans having resulted not in the vast financial windfall she ruthlessly sought, but in the bleak, uncompromising reality of long-term incarceration. Michael Dippolito, having narrowly survived the meticulously plotted assassination attempt through the proactive intervention of law enforcement, successfully divorced Dalia and slowly began the arduous, highly complex process of rebuilding his life and reclaiming the financial assets she had aggressively attempted to steal. The factual, meticulously documented record of this specific case stands as a stark, undeniable testament to the incredible, terrifying lengths an individual will go to when motivated by pure, unadulterated greed and a complete absence of human empathy. Yet, while Dalia sought to permanently eliminate her husband for mere financial gain, the dark, chilling spectrum of human malice encompasses far more complex, deeply disturbing motivations. Journeying from the sunny, deceptive environment of Florida to the rugged, mountainous landscapes of Colorado, investigators would soon be confronted with a highly chaotic, tragic case where a stepmother's erratic, deceptive behavior masked a horrific act of violence against a vulnerable child under her direct care. Gannon Stauch was an incredibly vibrant, 11-year-old boy residing in the quiet, newly developed suburban community of Lorson Ranch in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where he was deeply cherished by his family and peers for his bright, energetic personality. He lived in a complex, blended household managed primarily by his biological father, a dedicated member of the United States National Guard, whose professional obligations frequently required extended periods of travel and deployment away from the family residence. During these inevitable, prolonged absences, the demanding daily responsibilities of childcare and household management fell entirely onto the shoulders of Gannon's stepmother, Letecia Stauch, who actively presented herself to the outside world as a capable, loving, and dedicated maternal figure. To the casual observers in their seemingly idyllic, Mountain View neighborhood, the family dynamic appeared entirely functional and stable, bearing all the standard hallmarks of a comfortable, middle-class American existence devoid of any visible, underlying friction. However, this carefully maintained outward facade of suburban normalcy entirely obscured a deeply toxic, increasingly volatile environment festering behind the closed doors of their home, largely driven by Letecia's escalating psychological instability and deep-seated resentments. Gannon, due to his young age and natural dependency, occupied an incredibly vulnerable position within this household structure, relying completely on the very individual who would ultimately orchestrate his brutal demise. While Albert served his country miles away, trusting implicitly that his children were safe and adequately cared for, a dark, calculated animosity was quietly growing within Letecia, a malicious intent that remained completely undetected by the surrounding community. The stark, breathtaking beauty of the surrounding Colorado landscape stood in sharp unsettling contrast to the grim, claustrophobic reality that Gannon was actively forced to navigate during the final, terrifying days of his life. There were no obvious, documented warning signs or formal interventions by social services that could have predicted the catastrophic explosion of violence that was imminent, leaving the boy completely isolated with his eventual killer. This tragic juxtaposition of a seemingly safe, secure environment masking an imminent, lethal threat perfectly laid the absolute foundation for one of the most horrific, meticulously concealed betrayals of familial trust in recent investigative history. The agonizing, irrevocable destruction of the Stauch family's reality officially commenced on the bitterly cold afternoon of January 27, 2020, when Letecia formally contacted the El Paso County Sheriff's Office to report her 11-year-old stepson as a missing person. She deliberately crafted a seemingly plausible, entirely fabricated narrative for the initial responding deputies, claiming with fabricated concern that Gannon had left their residence earlier that day to visit a neighborhood friend's house, and had inexplicably failed to return home before dusk. Based solely on this preliminary deceptive information, local law enforcement initially categorized the pressing situation as a routine, albeit highly concerning, runaway child case, mobilizing immediate neighborhood canvasses and issuing standard public alerts to safely locate the boy. Hundreds of dedicated community volunteers, alongside deeply concerned neighbors and trained search and rescue personnel, bravely braved the freezing, treacherous winter conditions of the Colorado terrain, desperately scouring local parks, drainage culverts, and wooded areas for any sign of the missing child. However, as the freezing night rapidly transitioned into a second, agonizing day without a single, credible sighting or trace of Gannon, the fundamental plausibility of Letecia's initial runaway narrative began to rapidly disintegrate under the immense pressure of logical scrutiny. The severe life-threatening weather conditions made it incredibly improbable that a young boy could independently survive outside without adequate winter clothing, instantly elevating the urgency of the investigation and forcing seasoned detectives to fundamentally reevaluate the core circumstances of his disappearance. Investigators began to look closely at the immediate timeline preceding the 9/11 call, recognizing that the complete absence of digital footprints, neighborhood security camera footage showing Gannon leaving the house, or corroborating witness statements pointed toward a far more sinister reality. This critical, investigative pivot marked the absolute point of no return for the case, officially transforming the desperate search for a lost child into a highly suspicious, rapidly escalating criminal investigation focused squarely on the last person known to have seen him alive. Letecia's meticulously constructed illusion of a panic, grieving stepmother fundamentally fractured the moment law enforcement stopped viewing her as a distressed guardian and began treating her as the primary, focal subject of a potential homicide inquiry. The quiet, snow-covered streets of Lorson Ranch were instantly transformed from a peaceful residential haven into a highly active, sprawling crime scene, setting the definitive stage for a relentless pursuit of the horrifying truth hidden within the Stauch residence. As the intense, multi-agency investigation rapidly gained momentum, Letecia Stauch's public and private behavior devolved into a highly erratic, continuously shifting spectacle of deception that only served to solidify law enforcement's growing suspicions regarding her direct involvement. In a bizarre, deeply unsettling local news interview, she deliberately positioned herself with her back completely turned to the television camera, aggressively defending her own character and issuing defensive, convoluted statements rather than issuing a desperate, heartfelt plea for the safe return of her stepson. When seasoned detectives systematically presented her with logical inconsistencies in her initial timeline, she frantically began generating a continuous, dizzying array of entirely fabricated, contradictory narratives, including a highly detailed, baseless claim that Gannon had been violently abducted by a Hispanic male named Agardo. Meanwhile, Albert Stauch, completely devastated by the unfolding horror and working in strict, active cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, engaged in a series of highly monitored, recorded telephone conversations with Letecia in a desperate attempt to extract the truth. During these chilling, meticulously documented calls, Letecia spun an increasingly unhinged, impossible web of lies, desperately attempting to manipulate her husband while inadvertently revealing her deep, calculated awareness of the massive cover-up she was actively maintaining. The true, terrifying scope of her deception was finally, undeniably exposed when forensic crime scene technicians executed a comprehensive search warrant on the Stauch family residence, utilizing advanced chemical reagents to uncover massive, hidden quantities of biological evidence. Despite Letecia's extensive, frantic efforts to clean the crime scene, investigators discovered significant, undeniable blood spatter soaking through the carpet, heavily staining the concrete subfloor, and aggressively splattered across the walls of Gannon's own bedroom. Confronted with the imminent, undeniable collapse of her fabricated reality, Letecia abruptly fled the state of Colorado, renting a commercial van and embarking on a chaotic, cross-country journey to South Carolina, fundamentally unaware that federal investigators were meticulously tracking her every movement. This desperate flight across state lines left an undeniable, highly incriminating trail of digital location data and physical evidence, perfectly aligning her geographic trajectory with the dark, horrific secret she was actively transporting in the back of her rented vehicle. The investigation had seamlessly evolved into a highly coordinated, nationwide manhunt, driven by the absolute certainty that the missing boy had been brutally murdered within his own home, and that his killer was actively attempting to permanently erase the evidence of her crime. The agonizing weeks-long search for the missing boy reached its absolute, devastating culmination on March 18, 2020, nearly 2 months after his initial disappearance, in a location thousands of miles away from the snowy suburbs of Colorado. Contracted bridge inspectors conducting routine maintenance under the heavily trafficked Escambia River Bridge in Pace, Florida, noticed a discarded, fall-smelling suitcase abandoned in the shallow, muddy waters directly beneath the massive concrete overpass. Upon cautiously opening the deeply soiled luggage, local Florida law enforcement officials made a horrifying, instantly recognizable discovery, uncovering the heavily concealed, violently brutalized remains of 11-year-old Gannon Stauch wrapped tightly in multiple layers of bedding. The subsequent, meticulous forensic autopsy conducted by the state medical examiner officially revealed the sheer, unimaginable savagery of the premeditated attack, documenting a terrifying sequence of fatal injuries that completely defied any possibility of accidental death. The empirical medical evidence proved conclusively that Gannon had been viciously stabbed 18 times, subjected to massive, blunt force trauma to his skull, and ultimately shot squarely in the jaw with a lethal firearm before being hastily concealed. This grim geographical discovery in Florida perfectly, mathematically aligned with the meticulously tracked GPS data acquired from Letecia Stauch's rented commercial van, placing her directly at the exact location of the bridge during her frantic, cross-country escape route. The undeniable, physical recovery of the victim's body served as the ultimate, insurmountable climax of the entire investigation, instantly shattering the remaining fragments of Letecia's fabricated abduction theories and providing prosecutors with the concrete, irrefutable evidence required for a capital murder charge. Armed with this devastating confirmation, authorities swiftly intercepted Letecia in South Carolina, formally placing her under arrest and officially charging her with first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with a deceased human body. The horrific reality of a child slaughtered in his own sanctuary, transported across the country like discarded luggage, and tossed over a bridge finally brought the chilling, premeditated magnitude of Letecia's diabolical plan into the blinding light of public and judicial scrutiny. There were no more lies she could effectively spin, no more false narratives she could invent, as the physical evidence now spoke with absolute, deafening clarity on behalf of the young boy she had so brutally silenced. The judicial reckoning for Letecia Stauch was characterized by a prolonged, highly contentious legal process, during which she continuously attempted to aggressively manipulate the court system, desperately trying to delay the inevitable consequences of her horrific actions. Throughout the extensive pretrial proceedings, she engaged in a series of highly disruptive, calculated behaviors including blatantly feigning severe physical illness, violently assaulting a female correctional deputy during transport, and even orchestrating a failed, rudimentary escape attempt from the county jail. Recognizing the absolute futility of denying the overwhelming mountain of physical and digital evidence, her defense team ultimately pivoted to a formal legal strategy of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, asserting she had suffered a severe psychotic break during the time of the murder. However, during the highly publicized 2023 criminal trial, this desperate psychological defense was systematically and ruthlessly dismantled by the prosecution's expert psychiatric witnesses, who clinically demonstrated that her extensive, methodical efforts to clean the crime scene and dispose of the body proved a clear, undeniable awareness of guilt. The jury, presented with the pristine, undeniable facts of the brutal slaughter and the subsequent, highly organized cross-country cover-up, deliberated for only a few short hours before returning a definitive, unanimous verdict of guilty on all major charges, including first-degree murder. The presiding judicial authority, explicitly noting the exceptional, incomprehensible cruelty of her actions and her absolute lack of genuine remorse, delivered the maximum possible sentence allowable by law, condemning Letecia Stauch to life in a state penitentiary without the absolute possibility of parole. This definitive, uncompromising sentence provided a necessary, albeit incredibly painful, measure of legal closure for Albert Stauch, Gannon's biological mother Landon Bullard, and the devastated Colorado community that had tirelessly searched for the missing boy. She was permanently removed from civilized society, remanded to the secure confines of the Colorado Department of Corrections, where she will spend the remainder of her natural life in strict confinement, unable to ever inflict harm upon another vulnerable individual. The factual, meticulously documented record of this tragic case stands as a permanent, agonizing testament to the hidden dangers that can lurk within seemingly safe domestic environments, heavily shielded by the manipulative facades of those entrusted with care. Yet, while Letecia went to extraordinary, cross-country lengths to conceal the physical evidence of her crime, other perpetrators have inadvertently documented their own extreme cruelty on the very devices meant to capture their daily lives, a dark reality that investigators in Florida would soon uncover while examining a seemingly tragic, alcohol-fueled accident. George Torres Jr. was a 42-year-old man living in Winter Park, Florida, trapped in a profoundly toxic, highly volatile, and dangerously codependent romantic relationship with 42-year-old Sarah Boone, an environment completely saturated with mutual alcohol abuse and escalating physical altercations. To the external community and their immediate neighbors, their shared apartment was widely known as a constant, chaotic source of domestic disturbances, repeatedly drawing the attention of local law enforcement due to their explosive, unrestrained arguments that frequently spilled out into the public sphere. Their documented history of intimate partner violence was extensive and reciprocal, featuring numerous prior arrests for both individuals, where physical battery charges had been filed, temporary restraining orders had been issued, and judicial mandates to remain separated had been completely ignored in favor of reconciling their destructive bond. Despite the clear, undeniable legal interventions and the constant threat of further incarceration, the couple inevitably gravitated back to their shared residence, willingly returning to a claustrophobic, alcohol-fueled environment that served as a dangerous pressure cooker for their deep-seated resentments. George, despite his own documented flaws and struggles with severe addiction, frequently found himself on the receiving end of Boone's sharp, unforgiving temper, a dynamic that often resulted in visible physical injuries that he would subsequently attempt to hide or dismiss during police welfare checks. The fundamental structure of their daily lives revolved entirely around the consumption of cheap wine and liquor, a vicious, unbroken cycle of intoxication and confrontation that completely eroded any remaining foundation of mutual respect or basic human empathy within their relationship. This continuous, unchecked pattern of substance-induced hostility effectively isolated them from healthier social support networks, leaving them completely reliant on one another within a dark, closed-loop system of emotional and physical abuse that showed absolutely no signs of de-escalation. There were no meaningful interventions by family members or social services capable of penetrating this deeply fortified wall of mutual destruction, as both Boone and Torres actively chose to perpetuate their toxic dynamic rather than seek genuine, lasting rehabilitation. The cramped, dimly lit interior of their Winter Park apartment, littered with empty bottles and the lingering remnants of past physical struggles, stood as a silent, grim testament to a relationship that had entirely abandoned the concept of love in favor of an obsessive, mutually assured destruction. It was within this specific, highly combustible atmosphere of chronic intoxication and normalized violence that the stage was meticulously set for an unimaginably cruel, suffocating tragedy, one that would completely transcend their typical patterns of domestic assault and cross the absolute threshold into a prolonged, methodical act of torture. The catastrophic, irreversible culmination of their toxic entanglement was officially initiated on the afternoon of February 24, 2020, when a seemingly frantic Sarah Boone placed an emergency 911 call to the Orange County Sheriff's Office, desperately reporting that her boyfriend was completely unresponsive, stiff, and exhibiting a purple discoloration. During this initial, highly dramatic phone conversation with the emergency dispatcher, Boone actively constructed a convoluted, highly improbable narrative, claiming that she and George had been peacefully spending the previous evening drinking copious amounts of Chardonnay and completing jigsaw puzzles before deciding to play a drunken, spontaneous game of hide and seek. According to her carefully fabricated timeline, she asserted that George had willingly, playfully climbed inside a large, blue, hard shell vintage suitcase, and that she had subsequently zipped the piece of luggage completely shut, thinking it would be a harmless, hilarious prank to temporarily trap him inside. She continued her deceptive account by stating that, in her heavily intoxicated state, she had completely forgotten about his confined predicament, casually walked upstairs to her master bedroom, peacefully fallen asleep in her bed, and remained completely oblivious to his situation for hours, until she woke up the following day. Boone emphatically claimed to the dispatcher that upon waking, she realized George was nowhere to be found in the apartment, which suddenly prompted her to remember the hide and seek game, leading her back to the living room, where she finally unzipped the luggage to discover his lifeless body. When highly trained emergency medical technicians and local law enforcement deputies swiftly arrived at the chaotic Winter Park residence, they were immediately confronted with a grim, deeply disturbing physical reality that instantly contradicted the lighthearted, accidental narrative Boone was so desperately attempting to sell. George Torres Jr.'s rigid, heavily battered corpse was found, partially protruding from the unzipped blue suitcase, positioned awkwardly near the front door of the apartment, his physical form displaying clear, undeniable signs of a brutal, prolonged struggle that completely defied the concept of a peaceful, accidental suffocation. The responding officers instantly recognized that the sheer logistics of a grown man becoming completely trapped and subsequently dying in such a small enclosure without causing a massive, disruptive commotion were fundamentally impossible, immediately casting a massive shadow of profound suspicion over Boone's tearful, bewildered performance. The apartment itself showed no visible signs of forced entry or an outside physical altercation, definitively isolating the fatal event entirely within the closed ecosystem of their living room and firmly placing the absolute burden of explanation directly onto the sole surviving occupant. This highly suspicious, physically bizarre discovery served as the definitive inciting incident of the criminal investigation, instantly transitioning the scene from a tragic, alcohol-fueled medical emergency into a high-stakes, meticulously scrutinized homicide inquiry focused entirely on unraveling the dark, suffocating reality of George's final hours. As the formal criminal investigation rapidly intensified, seasoned homicide detectives transported Sarah Boone to the local precinct for a comprehensive, videotaped interrogation, carefully scrutinizing her continuously shifting demeanor and the glaring logical inconsistencies actively surfacing within her core narrative. During this prolonged, highly pressurized interview process, Boone aggressively maintained her defensive posture, repeatedly attempting to minimize her own culpability by portraying the entire catastrophic event as an incredibly unfortunate, completely unpredictable anomaly stemming from their mutual, severe intoxication. However, the initial findings from the county medical examiner's autopsy actively painted a horrifyingly violent, completely contradictory picture of George's final moments, detailing extensive, severe blunt force trauma across his physical form that completely destroyed Boone's claims of a peaceful, sleeping demise. The forensic pathologist meticulously documented significant, deep contusions on Torres's skull, a severe laceration on his lower lip, and numerous, highly indicative defensive bruises scattered across his shoulders and arms, suggesting he was either brutally beaten prior to being forced into the luggage or violently struck through the exterior fabric while trapped inside. When detectives strategically confronted Boone with this undeniable, empirical medical evidence of physical assault, her reactions completely lacked any genuine emotional empathy or appropriate horror, instead pivoting sharply toward an aggressive, cold irritation as she continuously attempted to justify her actions and deflect the blame onto the deceased victim. She callously described George's physical struggles within the suitcase as merely moving around, completely refusing to acknowledge the agonizing, desperate reality of a human being slowly asphyxiating in a cramped, dark space while actively fighting for his life against an unyielding zipper. In a critical, fateful moment of profound arrogance and misplaced confidence, Boone willingly signed a formal document granting the investigating detectives absolute, unrestricted consent to perform a full, forensic digital extraction on her personal cellular device, genuinely believing that the device contained absolutely no compromising evidence. She apparently assumed, in her deeply misguided state of mind, that her actions had gone completely undocumented, fundamentally unaware that the modern digital footprint is notoriously difficult to fully eradicate, and that her own smartphone was about to become the prosecution's most devastating, undeniable witness against her. The investigative team seamlessly handed the device over to specialized cyber forensic technicians who utilized advanced, highly sophisticated data retrieval software to meticulously comb through the deleted files, hidden caches, and recent video recordings stored within the phone's internal memory banks. The gradual, methodical uncovering of this digital data served as a masterclass in rising action, rapidly accelerating the investigation toward an inevitable, horrifying revelation that would completely shatter the last remaining fragments of Boone's accidental death narrative and expose the sheer, sadistic malice hiding beneath her intoxicated excuses. The absolute, undeniable climax of the entire investigation arrived with the devastating, horrifying discovery of two distinct, highly explicit video files recovered directly from Sarah Boone's mobile phone, capturing the exact, excruciating reality of George Torres Jr.'s prolonged execution. As seasoned detectives reviewed the pristine, undeniable digital footage in the sterile environment of the police precinct, they were forced to bear witness to a scene of such extreme, calculated psychological and physical torture that it left even the most hardened law enforcement veterans deeply disturbed. The first video clearly depicted the blue suitcase situated in the living room, heavily zipped shut, with the distinct, desperate sounds of Torres forcefully pushing against the restrictive fabric and violently struggling to manipulate the zipper from the inside in a frantic, terrifying bid for basic survival. From behind the camera, Boone's voice can be heard with chilling, absolute clarity, exhibiting a cruel, sadistic tone completely devoid of any intoxication-induced confusion, aggressively taunting the trapped man as he repeatedly, agonizingly yells out her name and explicitly states that he cannot breathe. Instead of rendering immediate, life-saving assistance, Boone callously laughed at his frantic pleas, coldly stating that this was exactly what he did when he choked her, directly utilizing his agonizing suffocation as a form of calculated, premeditated retaliation for their past domestic altercations. As Torres continued to desperately scream that he was actively dying and suffocating, Boone entirely dismissed his terror, responding with a profound, terrifying lack of empathy, asserting that it was on him and that this was how she felt when he cheated on her, transforming the confined space of the luggage into a literal, personalized execution chamber. The second recovered video further documented the ongoing, horrific ordeal, showing the suitcase repositioned within the room, indicating that Boone had actively engaged with the luggage, while Torres was still alive inside, deliberately choosing to prolong his suffering rather than end the nightmare. The absolute, undeniable clarity of the visual and audio recordings completely obliterated any possible legal defense of an accident or a drunken mistake, providing the state prosecution with an airtight, irrefutable documentation of a deeply malicious, highly intentional act of second-degree murder. Confronted with the overwhelming, insurmountable evidence of her own recorded sadism, Boone's carefully constructed, heavily guarded facade completely disintegrated, leaving her utterly exposed as a cold, calculating perpetrator who had actively chosen to document the systematic, torturous destruction of her partner's life. This digital exposure served as the ultimate, incontrovertible peak of tension, instantly transforming a confusing, murky domestic death into a stark, undeniable portrait of vengeance, proving mathematically that George Torres Jr. did not simply pass away in his sleep, but was actively, audibly murdered by the woman filming his demise. Armed with the indisputable, deeply disturbing video evidence meticulously extracted from her own cellular device, the Orange County Sheriff's Office immediately placed Sarah Boone under formal arrest, officially charging her with the severe, unyielding crime of second-degree murder. Following her highly publicized incarceration, the subsequent legal trajectory of her case devolved into an unprecedented, highly bizarre, and intensely protracted judicial circus, completely defined by Boone's continuous, arrogant manipulation of the legal system and her total refusal to cooperate with her own appointed legal representation. Over the course of several agonizingly long years, Boone systematically alienated and aggressively fired a staggering total of nearly a dozen different state-appointed public defenders, continuously submitting lengthy, handwritten, highly combative letters to the presiding judge complaining about their alleged incompetence and lack of absolute devotion to her impossible defense strategies. Her profoundly toxic, hostile behavior toward her own legal counsel resulted in massive, repeated delays in the trial schedule, forcing the judicial court to eventually take the incredibly rare, highly significant step of formally ruling that she had entirely forfeited her constitutional right to court-appointed representation due to her chronic, abusive obstructionism. Despite her aggressive, multifaceted attempts to control the narrative and completely derail the procedural momentum of the justice system, the absolute, objective weight of the recovered video recordings continuously hovered over the proceedings, functioning as an insurmountable, undeniable barrier to any potential claim of innocence. When she finally faced a jury of her peers, the prosecution relied heavily, almost exclusively, on her own recorded words and actions, broadcasting the horrific, haunting sounds of George's final, desperate pleas directly into the silent, solemn courtroom, completely devastating any lingering defense arguments of accidental death or battered spouse syndrome. The jury, presented with the pristine, indisputable facts of the agonizing torture session she had personally orchestrated and filmed, swiftly and unanimously returned a definitive verdict of guilty, legally cementing her status as a calculated, remorseless killer. Following this highly anticipated conviction, the presiding judicial authority, explicitly noting the exceptionally cruel, sadistic nature of the prolonged suffocation and her absolute lack of genuine human remorse, sentenced Boone to spend the remainder of her natural life in a maximum security state correctional facility. The final, factual documentation of this specific case stands as a chilling, modern testament to how the pervasive nature of technology can inadvertently capture the darkest, most terrifying depths of human malice, permanently locking away a perpetrator, utilizing their own digital arrogance against them. Yet, while Sarah Boone was a civilian whose toxic personal life culminated in a horrific, self-documented act of vengeance, the intricate, terrifying mechanics of a meticulously planned murder become infinitely more complex and chilling when the perpetrator is intimately familiar with the very investigative procedures designed to catch them. A terrifying reality perfectly illustrated by a Los Angeles detective who hid her crime in plain sight for over 2 decades. Sherry Rasmussen was a highly accomplished, deeply driven 29-year-old director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. A woman whose vibrant professional success was perfectly mirrored by her flourishing personal life and recent marriage to John Retton, a promising mechanical engineer. To her colleagues, friends, and devoted family, Sherry represented the absolute pinnacle of ambition and grace, building a bright, secure future in a quiet, upscale condominium complex nestled in the sprawling, sun-drenched suburbs of Van Nuys, California. However, the seemingly idyllic trajectory of her new-light existence was entirely overshadowed by the lingering, deeply toxic presence of John's former college acquaintance, Stephanie Lazarus, a highly competitive, physically imposing woman who had recently graduated from the Los Angeles Police Department Academy. During their time at the University of California, Los Angeles, John and Stephanie had engaged in a purely physical, casual romantic entanglement, a dynamic that John explicitly viewed as temporary and non-committal, but which Stephanie had internally cultivated into a profound, uncompromising, and ultimately dangerous psychological obsession. When John eventually ended their sporadic intimacies to pursue a serious, dedicated relationship with Sherry, Stephanie violently refused to accept the concrete reality of his rejection, exhibiting severe, escalating stalking behaviors that fundamentally breached the professional boundaries expected of a sworn law enforcement officer. She began showing up uninvited at John's apartment, aggressively demanding his attention, and repeatedly confronting Sherry in person at her hospital workplace, issuing dark, veiled threats that explicitly warned the young nurse that if Stephanie could not have John, absolutely no one else would. Despite these deeply unsettling, highly aggressive confrontations, Sherry and John fundamentally underestimated the lethal capacity of a woman who possessed not only a terrifying, unyielding obsession but also the specialized, tactical police training required to execute and conceal a violent crime. The inherent, perceived authority of Stephanie's LAPD badge provided her with a psychological shield and a terrifying level of operational confidence, allowing her to meticulously plot her revenge while actively hiding in plain sight as a supposed protector of the community. The quiet, secure sanctuary of Sherry's Van Nuys townhome, intended to be a safe haven for the newlyweds, was instead transforming into a highly targeted, premeditated focal point for a devastating act of jealousy, completely oblivious to the trained predator actively monitoring its daily rhythms. This deeply unsettling, asymmetrical dynamic, a civilian attempting to navigate the aggressive intimidation of an armed, trained officer of the law, perfectly established the grim, terrifying foundation for a murder that would successfully evade justice for nearly a quarter of a century. The fragile, carefully constructed peace of the Rutan household was violently and permanently eradicated on the tragic morning of February 24, 1986, when John returned to his Van Nuys condominium from work to discover his home in a state of absolute, chaotic devastation, completely stripped of its normal domestic tranquility. Upon cautiously entering the disrupted residence, his rising, unspoken panic instantly materialized into paralyzing, unadulterated horror as he found his beloved wife, Sherry Rasmussen, lying dead on the living room floor, her brutally battered body surrounded by massive, dark pools of coagulated blood. The crime scene was an immediate, visceral tableau of extreme, intimate violence, displaying clear, undeniable evidence of a massive, prolonged physical struggle that had aggressively moved throughout multiple rooms of the residence, leaving shattered glass, broken ceramics, and overturned furniture in its destructive wake. A subsequent, meticulous forensic autopsy officially documented the sheer, staggering brutality of the fatal encounter, revealing that Sherry had been viciously beaten in the face and head, deeply bitten on her inner left forearm, in a primal act of aggression, and ultimately executed with 3-point-blank gunshot wounds to the chest. To muffle the deafening sound of the fatal gunfire and avoid alerting the immediate neighbors in the densely populated complex, the assailant had deliberately utilized a thick, quilted blanket as a rudimentary silencer, a tactical, highly calculated maneuver that strongly suggested a level of premeditation and operational awareness far beyond a typical civilian crime. However, the initial, severely flawed investigation conducted by the local APD homicide detectives immediately fixated on a deeply erroneous, highly circumstantial theory, incorrectly interpreting the scattered electronics and missing marriage license as the clear, undeniable hallmarks of a botched daytime residential burglary gone horribly wrong. Despite the profound, desperate pleas from Sherry's grieving father, who explicitly and repeatedly warned investigators about the ongoing harassment and severe threats his daughter had faced from the ex-girlfriend cop, the institutional bias of the police department completely blinded them to the possibility that one of their own sworn officers could be the perpetrator. The investigative team stubbornly adhered to their initial, fundamentally flawed hypothesis, actively dismissing the highly personal, targeted nature of the overkill and instead fruitlessly pursuing phantom leads involving two unidentified male burglars, supposedly operating in the Van Nuys area. This catastrophic failure of investigative objectivity effectively served as the definitive inciting incident of a decades-long injustice, allowing the true architect of the slaughter to seamlessly integrate back into the ranks of the very department tasked with solving the crime. By failing to scrutinize the glaring, personal connections surrounding the victim, the LAPD inadvertently granted the killer an absolute, terrifying layer of institutional protection, ensuring that the cold, hard evidence required to close the case would remain buried within the department's own evidence lockers for an entire generation. For 23 agonizing, protracted years, the brutal murder of Sherry Rasmussen languished in the dusty, forgotten archives of the Los Angeles Police Department's Cold Case Division, a seemingly unsolvable enigma that slowly faded from the active institutional memory of the force. During this extensive period of investigative dormancy, Stephanie Lazarus not only entirely escaped suspicion, but actively thrived within the very organization she had profoundly betrayed, steadily climbing the departmental ranks, receiving numerous professional commendations, and ultimately achieving the highly prestigious, coveted position of lead detective within the specialized art theft detail. She married a fellow LAPD officer, fostered a seemingly normal, respectable life, and confidently walked the same heavily guarded hallways as the homicide detectives who had completely failed to recognize her as a ruthless, calculating killer. However, the relentless, uncompromising march of forensic science eventually caught up with her carefully guarded secrets in early 2009, when a highly dedicated team of cold case investigators decided to meticulously review the neglected Rasmussen file in order advanced modern DNA testing on the preserved biological evidence. The pivotal, world-shattering breakthrough occurred when laboratory technicians successfully extracted a pristine, highly conclusive genetic profile from the deep bite mark swab taken from Sherry's arm, a piece of evidence that had sat quietly degrading in a manila envelope for over 2 decades. The laboratory results delivered a completely unexpected, monumental shock to the investigative team. The DNA belonged unequivocally to a female assailant, instantly and permanently completely dismantling the original, deeply entrenched theory of a male, perpetrated botched residential burglary. This undeniable, biological revelation forced the modern detectives to finally revisit the desperate, ignored pleas of Sherry's father, leading them to quietly, intensely scrutinize Stephanie Lazarus, the very woman who now occupied a senior investigative office just a few floors away from their own desks. Recognizing the incredibly delicate, highly volatile nature of investigating a seasoned, high-ranking colleague within their own heavily armed department, the cold case detectives initiated an unprecedented, completely covered shadow operation, treating Lazarus with the extreme caution typically reserved for the most dangerous, unpredictable organized crime figures. They methodically cross-referenced duty logs from 1986, discovering that she had inexplicably checked out a specialized, secondary, .38 caliber revolver just days before the murder, a weapon she conveniently reported entirely stolen shortly after Sherry's death, a detail that perfectly matched the ballistics recovered from the Van Nuys crime scene. The rising, suffocating tension of the investigation reached an agonizing peak as the detectives realized they needed a completely covered, undeniably stealthy method to definitively match her modern DNA to the 1986 bite mark without triggering her highly tuned, professional police instincts or allowing her any opportunity to destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. The absolute, undeniable climax of this covert, high-stakes investigation was executed with surgical, terrifying precision, completely relying on the stealthy, calculated observation of their target during her routine, off-duty civilian life. A specialized, highly trained surveillance unit discreetly tailed Detective Lazarus as she casually ran errands on a sunny afternoon, patiently waiting for the perfect, fleeting opportunity, which finally materialized when she casually discarded a partially consumed plastic drink cup into a public garbage receptacle outside a local Costco store. Forensic technicians swiftly and covertly retrieved the discarded item, rushing it to the State Crime Laboratory for immediate, high-priority processing, where analysts mathematically and conclusively confirmed that the genetic material left on the plastic straw was an absolute 1 in a billion match to the saliva recovered from Sherry Rasmussen's brutalized forearm. Armed with this devastating, irrefutable biological proof, the cold case unit orchestrated a masterful, psychologically agonizing trap, deliberately intercepting Lazarus within the secure confines of the police headquarters under the completely fabricated guise of needing her specialized expertise to interview a suspect regarding a stolen art case. As she confidently entered the sterile, heavily wired interrogation room, entirely stripped of her duty weapon due to standard protocol for entering the secure jail area, she was blissfully, arrogantly unaware that the entire scenario was an elaborate, heavily coordinated theatrical production designed specifically for her absolute destruction. The interrogating detectives, initially maintaining a highly deferential, professional, and entirely collegial tone, began by asking mundane, seemingly unrelated questions, slowly, methodically tightening the psychological noose before suddenly pivoting to the events of February 1986. The hidden cameras flawlessly captured the exact, terrifying moment of realization dawning across Lazarus's face as the detective systematically confronted her with the inescapable inconsistencies of her past, her relationship with John Ruetten, and finally, the undeniable, scientific reality of her own DNA found directly on the victim's body. Her highly trained, confident police persona completely and rapidly disintegrated into a panicked, evasive, and highly defensive posture, as she desperately attempted to deploy the very same interrogation evasion tactics she had utilized against criminals for decades, claiming a sudden, profound lapse in memory regarding the events of that year. The psychological destruction was absolute and total. The hunter had undeniably become the hunted. Cornered within the very institutional walls she had arrogantly used as a shield, culminating in her dramatic, unprecedented arrest by her own colleagues, completely severing her 23-year illusion of untouchability. The highly publicized, deeply sensational trial of Stephanie Lazarus formally commenced in early 2012, serving as an incredibly rare, deeply uncomfortable public reckoning that forced the Los Angeles Police Department to openly acknowledge and confront its own historical, catastrophic failures in investigative objectivity. Throughout the extensive courtroom proceedings, the defense team launched desperate, highly technical attacks on the integrity of the decades-old evidence, aggressively attempting to argue that the crucial bite mark swab had been irreparably contaminated, severely degraded, or fundamentally mishandled by incompetent evidence custodians over the intervening 23 years. However, the prosecution meticulously and thoroughly dismantled these defensive arguments with an overwhelming, scientifically impenetrable wall of expert testimony, clearly demonstrating that the DNA match was mathematically absolute and completely corroborated by the recovered ballistics, her suspicious behavior, and her deeply documented pathological obsession with John Ruetten. The jury, presented with the pristine, indisputable facts of the brutal slaughter and the subsequent, highly calculated evasion of justice, deliberated for only a short period before returning a definitive, unanimous verdict, formally finding Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The presiding judicial authority, explicitly emphasizing the exceptionally profound, unprecedented betrayal of the public trust and the extreme, chilling arrogance required to hide behind a law enforcement badge after committing a cold-blooded slaughter, delivered a stringent sentence of 27 years to life in a maximum security state penitentiary. This definitive, uncompromising sentence finally provided a long overdue deeply necessary measure of true legal closure for Sherry Rasmussen's devastated family, who had valiantly and relentlessly fought against immense institutional indifference for nearly 3 decades to ensure that their daughter's killer was brought into the blinding light of justice. Lazarus was permanently stripped of her badge, her pension, and her freedom, remanded to the secure confines of the California Institution for Women, where her numerous, highly technical legal appeals have been systematically and repeatedly denied by the higher appellate courts. The factual, meticulously documented record of this monumental case stands as a chilling, permanent testament to the dark reality that specialized knowledge and institutional power can be heavily weaponized to conceal the most diabolical, premeditated acts of human malice. Yet, while Lazarus relied on decades of silence and the blind trust of her colleagues to maintain her facade, other perpetrators attempt to immediately rewrite the physical narrative of their crimes by presenting themselves as the brutally victimized survivors of phantom attackers. A profoundly manipulative strategy that investigators would soon have to untangle in the muddy, freezing rural landscapes of Wisconsin. Alex Woodworth was a bright, intellectually curious 24-year-old substitute teacher and barista residing in the vibrant college town of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where his gentle demeanor and philosophical disposition made him a beloved figure among his extensive circle of peers. His quiet, relatively uncomplicated life became fatally intertwined with a highly volatile, deeply chaotic 20-year-old individual who had recently adopted the name Ezra McCandless, a young woman with a profoundly turbulent psychological history and a documented propensity for weaving elaborate, attention-seeking fictions. Ezra existed within a highly complex, intensely dramatic social ecosystem, actively maintaining a long-term, turbulent romantic relationship with a 33-year-old military medic named Jason Mengel, while simultaneously engaging in a deeply covered, intensely physical affair with Alex behind Jason's back. This clandestine love triangle inevitably created a highly combustible, inherently unsustainable environment, completely saturated with emotional manipulation, intense jealousies, and Ezra's continuous, desperate attempts to meticulously control the narratives and loyalties of both men in her life. In the weeks directly preceding the tragedy, the fragile architecture of these interconnected relationships began to violently collapse as Jason officially discovered the ongoing infidelity, leading to a series of highly explosive public confrontations that fundamentally destabilized Ezra's carefully constructed social reality. Fearing the absolute loss of control and the imminent, public exposure of her multifaceted deceptions, Ezra began to view Alex not as a secret lover, but as an existential, completely unacceptable threat to her desired future and her preferred version of reality. The sweeping, picturesque farmlands and dense, isolated woods surrounding the Eau Claire area, typically a symbol of rural tranquility, quietly transformed into the heavily isolated staging ground for a dark, premeditated resolution to this deeply toxic romantic entanglement. Alex, entirely unaware of the lethal, calculated animosity actively festering within the mind of the woman he had intimately trusted, willingly agreed to meet with Ezra to finalize the dissolution of their complicated dynamic, fundamentally underestimating the catastrophic danger he was walking into. This seemingly mundane, everyday interpersonal conflict, a messy breakup between young adults, served as the completely obscured, silent foundation for an act of overwhelming, calculated savagery that would completely devastate a tight-knit community. The devastating, irreversible reality of this lethal intersection violently announced itself on the late afternoon of March 22, 2018, when an exhausted, heavily bleeding Ezra McCandless suddenly appeared on the doorstep of an isolated dairy farm in rural Spring Valley, Wisconsin, located miles away from the city limits. The seasoned dairy farmer who opened his front door was immediately confronted by a deeply disturbing, chaotic visual. Ezra was completely covered from head to toe in thick, freezing mud and copious amounts of fresh blood, her clothing heavily torn, and her physical demeanor projecting absolute, frantic terror. She desperately pleaded for immediate sanctuary and medical assistance, frantically claiming to the bewildered homeowner that she had just been the victim of a brutal, unprovoked sexual assault and a terrifying physical attack by her former lover, Alex Woodworth, forcefully alleging that he had suddenly snapped and tried to slaughter her on a deserted country dirt road. The local Dunn County Sheriff's deputies and emergency medical technicians rapidly descended upon the quiet rural property, immediately transporting Ezra to a regional medical facility for a comprehensive assault examination, while simultaneously deploying specialized tactical units to secure the perimeter and locate the supposedly violent, highly dangerous perpetrator. Based entirely on Ezra's highly dramatic, seemingly traumatized initial statements, the responding law enforcement personnel fundamentally believed they were actively hunting a deranged, heavily armed male suspect who posed an imminent, lethal threat to the surrounding rural community. However, this desperate, high-stakes manhunt was abruptly and horrifyingly truncated when a separate patrol unit located Ezra's deeply mired, abandoned vehicle violently stuck in the deep mud on a heavily rutted, extremely isolated logging trail a short distance from the dairy farm. Upon cautiously approaching the heavily damaged, blood-streaked car, the deputies did not find a fleeing attacker, but rather made a profoundly grim, completely contradictory discovery: the lifeless, severely mutilated body of Alex Woodworth, violently slumped across the back seat, his physical form bearing the unmistakable, horrific hallmarks of an aggressive, sustained, and deeply personal overkill. This catastrophic, undeniable physical reality instantly and fundamentally shattered the core premise of Ezra's frantic assault narrative, officially transitioning the incident from a search for a violent fugitive into a highly complex, meticulously scrutinized homicide investigation focused squarely on the sole survivor, who was actively painting herself as the primary victim. As seasoned homicide detectives initiated a rigorous, deeply probing interrogation of Ezra McCandless within the sterile confines of the hospital, her carefully constructed facade of traumatized victimization began to rapidly, spectacularly disintegrate under the immense pressure of objective, forensic scrutiny. During these critical, highly documented early interviews, Ezra continuously and frantically altered the fundamental details of her timeline, initially claiming complete amnesia regarding the actual murder before abruptly shifting to a highly convoluted, completely improbable narrative wherein she managed to miraculously overpower her supposedly physically dominant attacker, wrestling the weapon away and stabbing him strictly in desperate self-defense. The forensic pathologists conducting the extensive, meticulous autopsy on Alex Woodworth uncovered a horrific sequence of injuries that completely defied the physical logistics of a spontaneous, defensive struggle, documenting 16 distinct, incredibly deep stab wounds aggressively targeting his head, neck, torso, and groin, injuries that strongly indicated a highly motivated, predatory assault rather than a desperate attempt to escape. Furthermore, the specialized crime scene technicians analyzing the blood spatter patterns and the physical condition of the heavily saturated vehicle interior determined conclusively that Alex was completely trapped in the confined space of the back seat when the overwhelming violence was unleashed upon him, fundamentally contradicting Ezra's claims of an open-air struggle on the dirt road. The investigation uncovered a profoundly disturbing, highly premeditated digital trail actively left behind by Ezra in the days leading up to the slaughter, revealing chilling internet search queries on her personal devices directly asking how to make a murder look like an accident, and extensively researching the physical anatomy of fatal arterial strikes. The most shocking, deeply manipulative physical evidence emerged when emergency room doctors closely examined the superficial lacerations on Ezra's arms, specifically noting that the word "Y" had been deeply, painstakingly carved into her own flesh. While Ezra aggressively attempted to weaponize her own gender identity struggles, vehemently claiming that Alex had sadistically carved the derogatory word into her arm during his alleged sexual assault, forensic medical experts mathematically and conclusively proved through the precise angles, hesitation marks, and depth of the cuts that the wounds were completely, undeniably self-inflicted in a desperate, calculated bid to fabricate physical evidence of a hate crime. Every single lie, every manufactured piece of evidence, and every dramatic, tearful performance was systematically and ruthlessly dismantled by the relentless, objective accumulation of empirical data, transforming the police perspective of Ezra from a deeply traumatized survivor into a highly calculated, deeply manipulative, and fundamentally ruthless architect of a premeditated execution. The absolute, undeniable climax of this harrowing saga unfolded within the heavily guarded, intensely scrutinized confines of the Dunn County Courthouse during the late fall of 2019, where Ezra McCandless confidently opted to take the witness stand in her own defense. A catastrophic legal miscalculation that perfectly exposed her profound, narcissistic arrogance to the jury. Over the course of her extensive, deeply theatrical testimony, she desperately attempted to deploy the same psychological manipulations she had utilized in her personal life, aggressively weaving a labyrinthine, deeply convoluted narrative that attempted to simultaneously portray Alex as a violent, deranged monster and herself as a fragile, misunderstood victim who merely fought to survive. However, the state prosecution executed a masterclass in cross-examination, systematically and mercilessly deconstructing her final, desperate facade by confronting her directly with the pristine, undeniable digital forensics, the irrefutable blood spatter geometry, and her own deeply contradictory, highly documented prior statements to law enforcement. The ultimate, devastating breaking point of the trial arrived when the prosecution meticulously mapped out the exact, premeditated sequence of events, proving mathematically that Ezra had deliberately lured Alex to the highly isolated, impassable dirt road under the completely false pretense of returning his personal belongings, ensuring there would be absolutely no witnesses or possible avenues of immediate escape. They clearly demonstrated how she aggressively initiated the surprise attack while he was highly vulnerable and completely confined within the vehicle, utilizing a concealed, premeditated weapon she had deliberately brought to the meeting, completely obliterating any remaining, fragile illusions regarding a spontaneous act of self-defense. The jury, presented with the overwhelming, insurmountable evidence of her elaborate, self-inflicted wounds designed to frame the dead man and the chilling, cold-blooded internet searches explicitly mapping out the intended crime, was forced to confront the dark, uncompromising reality of a deeply sociopathic intelligence hiding behind a veneer of youthful chaos. This definitive, highly public exposure served as the ultimate, incontrovertible peak of tension, completely stripping away Ezra's meticulously crafted victimhood and leaving her utterly exposed as a cold, calculating perpetrator who had actively chosen to slaughter an innocent man simply because he was no longer convenient to her preferred narrative. On November 1, 2019, following merely a few hours of intense, deeply unified deliberation, the jury returned a definitive and resounding verdict, formally finding Ezra McCandless guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, completely and legally rejecting her multifaceted, evolving claims of self-defense and sexual assault. This verdict served as a complete, undeniable judicial repudiation of the elaborate, highly manipulative fictions she had aggressively attempted to force upon the law enforcement community, firmly establishing her actions as a cold-blooded, meticulously calculated execution designed to violently eliminate a perceived obstacle in her personal life. The subsequent sentencing hearing provided a deeply solemn, emotionally heavy platform for Alex Woodworth's devastated family to directly articulate the profound, irreplaceable void left by his brutal murder, their heartbreaking testimonies underscoring the senseless, completely unnecessary nature of the tragedy. The presiding judicial authority, explicitly noting the exceptional, deeply manipulative cruelty of framing the victim for his own murder and her absolute, documented lack of genuine remorse throughout the entire process, delivered a stringent sentence of life in a state penitentiary, mandating that she serve an absolute minimum of 50 years behind bars before even being eligible to petition for supervised parole. This strict, uncompromising sentencing structure ensured that McCandless would remain permanently removed from civilized society for the vast majority of her natural life, effectively ending her capacity to manipulate, deceive, or physically harm others outside of a highly controlled institutional environment. She was subsequently transferred to the secure confines of the Letecia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, her deeply chaotic, attention-seeking lifestyle permanently replaced by the rigid, unyielding routine of maximum security confinement. The factual, meticulously documented record of this specific case stands as a stark, permanent testament to the extreme, terrifying lengths an individual will go to in order to maintain a fabricated reality, aggressively weaponizing false allegations to obscure an act of profound, unadulterated malice. Yet, while Ezra McCandless utilized her adult autonomy and the isolated rural landscape to orchestrate her crime, the chilling, methodical capacity for violence is not exclusively confined to those of legal age, a horrifying reality that investigators in Missouri would soon discover when a deeply disturbed adolescent decided to act upon her darkest, most deeply concealed psychological impulses. Elizabeth Alton was a vibrant, deeply innocent 9-year-old girl residing in the heavily wooded, remarkably quiet suburban enclave of St. Martin's, Missouri, a close-knit community where children routinely played outdoors without the slightest shadow of parental apprehension. She lived a life defined by typical childhood joys, characterized by a love for animals, a bright, infectious smile, and a profound sense of safety within the familiar boundaries of her neighborhood streets. However, this idyllic, secure environment was silently shared with a deeply troubled 15-year-old neighbor named Alyssa Bustamante, an adolescent whose internal psychological landscape was rapidly deteriorating into a profoundly dark, dangerous abyss of morbid fascinations. While Alyssa outwardly navigated the standard social routines of attending the local high school and interacting with peers, she was simultaneously cultivating a severe, highly documented history of acute depression, aggressive self-harm, and previous suicide attempts. Beneath this visible layer of adolescent turmoil lay a far more sinister, deeply concealed obsession with death and extreme violence, a dark fixation that she actively nurtured through her consumption of disturbing online content and her own increasingly macabre social media presence. Unbeknownst to the parents and children of St. Martin's, Alyssa had quietly transitioned from merely ideating about violence to actively, meticulously plotting a fatal physical execution, driven solely by a chilling, completely unprovoked desire to experience the physiological sensation of taking a human life. The sheer proximity of these two contrasting lives, the innocent child playing in the sun and the disturbed teenager brooding in the shadows, created a terrifying, invisible collision course within the seemingly impenetrable safety of their shared neighborhood. There were absolutely no formal warnings or institutional interventions capable of predicting the catastrophic explosion of premeditated malice that was imminent, leaving Elizabeth completely vulnerable to a predator residing merely a few doors down. Alyssa's carefully maintained outward facade of a typical, albeit moody, teenager completely and effectively masked the deeply psychopathic urges she was actively preparing to unleash upon an unsuspecting, defenseless target. The towering, dense forests that closely bordered the manicured lawns of their community, typically a scenic backdrop for suburban life, were quietly transforming into the meticulously selected staging ground for a horrific, calculated slaughter. The profound, irreversible destruction of this suburban tranquility officially commenced on the crisp, autumn afternoon of October 21, 2009, when young Elizabeth Alton happily walked down her street to visit a nearby friend's house, a completely routine activity in their highly trusting community. As the late afternoon rapidly transitioned into the encroaching darkness of the evening, Elizabeth's mother grew increasingly anxious when her daughter failed to return home by the explicitly agreed upon curfew, prompting her to initiate frantic phone calls to neighbors and friends. When it became agonizingly clear that the 9-year-old girl had seemingly vanished into thin air without leaving a single trace, the initial wave of parental concern instantly mutated into absolute, paralyzing terror, leading to an immediate emergency dispatch to the local Cole County Sheriff's Department. The quiet, dimly lit streets of St. Martin's were abruptly flooded with the blinding, flashing lights of numerous law enforcement patrol vehicles, marking the definitive, terrifying transition from a peaceful evening into the frantic, chaotic epicenter of a massive missing child investigation. Hundreds of deeply concerned local residents, trained search and rescue personnel, and seasoned police deputies rapidly mobilized, grabbing flashlights and organizing extensive grid searches to systematically scour the dense, unforgiving woods that completely surrounded the residential development. The freezing temperatures of the descending night severely amplified the urgent, life-threatening nature of the situation, as investigators aggressively deployed specialized tracking dogs and requested aerial support in a desperate, high-stakes attempt to locate the missing child before she succumbed to the harsh elements. Throughout this agonizing, chaotic preliminary search, there were absolutely no obvious signs of a struggle, no ransom notes, and no credible eyewitness sightings to provide the desperate search teams with a definitive geographical direction, leaving the community paralyzed by a suffocating sense of helplessness. The fundamental, deeply unsettling mystery of how a vibrant child could simply evaporate from a heavily populated neighborhood within a matter of minutes served as the primary inciting incident, propelling the investigation forward with an intense, unyielding momentum. As the first 24 hours agonizingly passed without a single shred of actionable evidence, the agonizing realization began to settle over the command center that they were likely no longer conducting a rescue mission, but rather a grim, highly complex criminal investigation. This terrifying pivot permanently shattered the collective illusion of safety within St. Martin's, forcing investigators to look inward and heavily scrutinize the very residents who had volunteered to aid in the search, entirely unaware that the architect of this nightmare was walking right beside them. As the intense, multi-agency investigation rapidly expanded to include the specialized resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, seasoned detectives began meticulously interviewing every single resident, focusing heavily on the local teenagers who were known to frequent the wooded areas. During this exhaustive, highly methodical canvassing process, investigators immediately noted the unusually calm, emotionally detached, and distinctly inappropriate demeanor exhibited by 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, a stark contrast to the overwhelming panic consuming the rest of the neighborhood. This profound lack of empathy, combined with the discovery of her deeply disturbing digital footprint, which included public social media posts expressing a fascination with lethal weapons and self-mutilation, instantly elevated Alyssa from a routine witness to a highly suspicious primary person of interest. The psychological tension of the investigation escalated dramatically when detectives learned the horrifying fact that Alyssa had deceptively participated in the community search efforts, casually blending in with the terrified volunteers while possessing absolute, secret knowledge of the child's horrific fate. Armed with mounting circumstantial suspicion and the teenager's documented history of severe psychological instability, law enforcement officials swiftly secured and executed a comprehensive search warrant on the Bustamante residence, deploying forensic technicians to meticulously dissect her personal living space. The search of her bedroom yielded a chilling, undeniable glimpse into a deeply fractured, highly dangerous mind, but it was the quiet, unassuming discovery of her personal, handwritten diary that would ultimately serve as the devastating key to unlocking the entire gruesome mystery. Investigators carefully flipping through the pages of the journal noticed a specific, highly suspicious entry dated on the exact day of Elizabeth's disappearance, where the original text had been aggressively, frantically scribbled over with thick blue ink in a desperate attempt to permanently obscure the words. Recognizing the immense, potential evidentiary value of this concealed writing, the local detectives immediately transported the seized journal to the State Crime Laboratory, tasking specialized forensic document examiners with the highly technical, painstaking process of deciphering the hidden confession. The systematic, scientific recovery of this buried text represented the ultimate culmination of the rising action, a methodical, unstoppable march toward an undeniable truth that would completely obliterate any lingering hope for the missing child's safe return. As the forensic technicians utilized advanced lighting techniques and digital enhancement to slowly peel back the layers of ink, they were forced to bear witness to an act of premeditated, cold-blooded savagery that fundamentally defied human comprehension, especially coming from the hand of a 15-year-old girl. The absolute, irrefutable climax of the entire investigation arrived with the devastating, horrifying deciphering of the concealed diary entry, exposing a written narrative so saturated with pure, unadulterated evil that it profoundly shocked even the most hardened, veteran law enforcement officials. In her own pristine, undeniable handwriting, Alyssa Bustamante meticulously detailed the exact, excruciating reality of her horrific actions, explicitly confessing that she had intentionally strangled Elizabeth, forcefully slit her throat, and repeatedly stabbed her simply to satisfy a morbid curiosity. The most terrifying, deeply chilling aspect of this written confession was not just the clinical description of the extreme violence, but the profound, sadistic joy she explicitly expressed, concluding the entry by proudly declaring that the experience of taking a human life was amazing. Armed with this staggering, insurmountable documentary evidence of a highly premeditated, thrill-kill execution, seasoned homicide detectives immediately confronted the teenager in the interrogation room, permanently shattering her stoic, defiant facade with the undeniable reality of her own written words. Faced with the absolute collapse of her dark secret, Alyssa completely abandoned her previous denials and delivered a cold, emotionless verbal confession, detailing exactly how she had deliberately lured the trusting 9-year-old into the dense woods under the false pretense of showing her something interesting. The true, staggering magnitude of her cold-blooded premeditation was fully exposed when she calmly informed the interrogating officers that she had meticulously dug a shallow grave in the forest floor several days prior to the actual murder, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to strike. In the dark, early hours of the morning, Alyssa physically led a heavy contingent of police officers and crime scene technicians deep into the unforgiving Missouri brush, silently guiding them to the exact, heavily concealed location where she had hastily buried her innocent victim. The agonizing, heartbreaking exhumation of Elizabeth Olten's brutally mutilated remains served as the definitive, insurmountable peak of the investigation, instantly transforming a frantic missing person case into a stark, undeniable portrait of a highly organized, psychopathic slaughter. This grim, geographical discovery fundamentally proved that this was not a spontaneous tragedy or an accidental death, but rather the flawless execution of a diabolical, deeply considered plan orchestrated by a predator hiding behind the mask of youth. The physical recovery of the body provided the state prosecution with the airtight, irrefutable corroboration required to charge the teenager with capital murder, completely severing any possibility of her escaping the devastating legal consequences of her monstrous actions. The subsequent judicial reckoning for Alyssa Bustamante was heavily defined by a highly contentious, deeply emotional legal battle regarding her fundamental culpability. As prosecutors aggressively and successfully petitioned to have her legally certified to stand trial as a fully responsible adult due to the extreme severity and premeditation of the crime. Throughout the extensive, highly publicized court proceedings, her defense team desperately attempted to utilize her documented history of severe depression, prolonged usage of psychiatric medication, and an allegedly traumatic childhood as mitigating factors to lessen her ultimate sentence and avoid a mandatory life term without parole. However, just days before the capital murder trial was scheduled to officially commence, Alyssa chose to avoid the profound uncertainty of a jury verdict by formally accepting a binding plea agreement, pleading guilty to the lesser, but still massive, charges of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. During the agonizing, emotionally charged sentencing hearing, Elizabeth Olten's devastated family delivered powerful, heartbreaking victim impact statements, directly confronting the cold, emotionless killer and forcefully articulating the profound, permanent destruction she had inflicted upon their lives and their tight-knit community. The presiding judicial authority, explicitly emphasizing the exceptionally cruel, highly calculated nature of the pre-dug grave and the chilling, remorseless joy expressed within her personal diary, delivered a stringent sentence of life in a state penitentiary with the distant possibility of parole, augmented by an additional, consecutive 30-year sentence. This definitive, uncompromising sentence ensured that Bustamante would be removed from civilized society for the vast majority of her natural life. remanded to the secure confines of a Missouri women's correctional facility, where she continues to serve her heavily monitored time. The factual, meticulously documented record of this specific case stands as a permanent, terrifying testament to the chilling reality that pure, psychopathic malice is not strictly bound by age, and that a deeply lethal, premeditated threat can easily hide behind the unassuming face of a neighborhood teenager. While the St. Martin's community slowly attempted to heal from this unprecedented, localized tragedy, the dangerous combination of severe psychological instability and a deep fascination with violence frequently refuses to remain geographically contained. In fact, moving from the quiet woods of Missouri to the rugged landscapes of Virginia, investigators would soon encounter another deeply disturbed young woman whose obsession with taking a life did not end in a hidden grave, but instead erupted into a highly public, cross-country spectacle of murder broadcast directly onto the internet. The terrifying intersection of extreme violence and modern social media exhibitionism was about to establish a profoundly dark new precedent, completely redefining the public visibility of a killer's active descent into madness. Charles Taylor was a 59-year-old man living a relatively quiet, unassuming life in a scenic, mountainous region of Christiansburg, Virginia, hoping to find peace in his later years despite a deeply fractured family dynamic. His relationship with his son, Rex Taylor, was historically turbulent, heavily strained by Rex's severe, chronic struggles with substance abuse and deep-seated psychological depression. Rex was married to a young woman named Amanda Taylor, an individual whose internal psychological landscape was profoundly saturated with a dark, lifelong obsession with extreme violence, notorious serial killers, and the macabre aesthetics of death. When Rex tragically ended his own life in August of 2014, hanging himself in a storage shed, the fragile remnants of Amanda's mental stability completely and irreparably shattered, plunging her into a catastrophic downward spiral of misdirected vengeance. Instead of seeking healthy psychological intervention to process her profound grief, Amanda aggressively fixated her profound anger entirely onto her father-in-law, Charles, irrationally and obsessively blaming him for introducing Rex to narcotics years prior and ultimately causing his suicide. This deep-seated, heavily misplaced animosity rapidly festered within her increasingly detached mind, transforming her from a grieving widow into a highly motivated, vindictive predator actively seeking a tangible target for her immense psychological pain. Amanda's online persona simultaneously devolved into a highly disturbing echo chamber of violent ideation, where she openly idolized mass murderers and continuously broadcasted her escalating, lethal intentions to a digital audience that largely dismissed her dark rhetoric as mere internet edginess. The quiet, residential stability of Charles Taylor's Virginia home remained entirely ignorant of the deadly, calculated storm that was actively gathering momentum just outside its doors, completely unaware that his own daughter-in-law was meticulously planning his brutal execution. This volatile intersection of deep familial trauma and unchecked, sociopathic obsessions established a uniquely terrifying foundation for a crime that would not only destroy a family, but actively seek a global audience. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic explosion of premeditated violence, driven by a deeply twisted sense of retributive justice that recognized absolutely no moral or legal boundaries. The catastrophic, irreversible culmination of Amanda Taylor's dark obsessions violently materialized on the afternoon of April 4, 2015, when she explicitly decided to transform her digital fantasies into a gruesome, physical reality, accompanied by a deeply impressionable, 32-year-old accomplice named Sean Ball, who harbored a desperate, unrequited romantic affection for her. Amanda confidently approached Charles Taylor's Christiansburg residence armed with a premeditated, lethal intent and a fixed, blade-hunting knife. Upon gaining entry to the unassuming home, under the guise of a routine familial visit, the atmosphere instantly shifted from deceptive calm to absolute, unrestrained savagery as Amanda relentlessly attacked the 59-year-old man as he sat defenseless on his living room sofa. She viciously and repeatedly drove the heavy blade into her father-in-law's chest and neck, executing a highly aggressive, sustained physical assault that explicitly mirrored the very true crime atrocities she had idolized for years on the internet. As Charles desperately fought for his life, sustaining severe defensive wounds in a futile attempt to halt the overwhelming violence, Sean Ball actively facilitated the slaughter, effectively trapping the victim and ensuring that Amanda could successfully complete her horrific, self-appointed mission of vengeance. Following the brutal execution, the local Virginia authorities were eventually alerted to the residents, completely unprepared for the sheer volume of blood and the grotesque, undeniable physical evidence of overkill that aggressively saturated the otherwise ordinary living room. First responding officers and forensic technicians, arriving at the grim scene, were immediately struck by the highly personal, exceptionally violent nature of the fatal injuries, recognizing instantly that this was not a random home invasion but a deeply targeted, emotional slaughter. The discovery of Charles Taylor's heavily mutilated body served as the definitive, terrifying, inciting incident of the investigation, instantly transitioning a quiet, mountain town into the epicenter of a frantic, high-stakes homicide inquiry. Law enforcement agencies were immediately forced to pivot from routine patrol duties to actively hunting a pair of highly dangerous, completely unhinged fugitives who had successfully vanished into the surrounding Appalachian landscape. This horrific, blood-soaked living room represented the absolute point of no return, a physical manifestation of a broken mind that had willingly crossed the ultimate threshold from morbid curiosity into active, cold-blooded murder. As a massive, multi-jurisdictional manhunt was rapidly mobilized across the state of Virginia, the investigation took an unprecedented, deeply surreal turn into the digital realm, completely redefining the modern dynamics of a criminal pursuit. Instead of attempting to covertly evade capture and maintain a low profile, Amanda Taylor aggressively weaponized her social media platforms, deliberately utilizing Instagram to boldly broadcast her horrific actions directly to the public in real time. She posted a deeply chilling, highly incriminating photograph of the blood-stained hunting knife resting ominously on her lap, accompanying the visual evidence with a lengthy, remorseless caption explicitly detailing how she had just murdered her father-in-law in a supposed act of righteous vengeance for her late husband. This unprecedented digital exhibitionism completely bypassed traditional investigative channels, providing law enforcement and the horrified public with an immediate, undeniable, and entirely self-authored documentation of the premeditated slaughter. Furthermore, Amanda actively utilized a secondary, highly disturbing blog site to continuously post live updates regarding their cross-country flight, openly taunting the pursuing authorities, expressing a profound, sadistic satisfaction with the physical act of killing, and explicitly wishing she could experience the thrill of the murder all over again. These continuous, deeply psychopathic online transmissions created a highly volatile, rapidly escalating pressure cooker for the pursuing fugitive task forces, who were desperately attempting to track the digital breadcrumbs before the pair could strike again or completely disappear across state lines. The fugitives utilized the stolen funds and vehicle acquired from their victim to desperately navigate the rural highways, plunging deeper into the neighboring state of North Carolina, while the digital world watched the chaotic, deadly spectacle unfold in absolute horror. The tension reached an agonizing, suffocating peak when investigators realized that Sean Ball's usefulness to Amanda was rapidly expiring. Deeply concerned that the sociopathic killer would inevitably turn her extreme violence toward her own willing accomplice as their situation grew increasingly desperate. This bizarre, highly public fusion of extreme violence and social media attention seeking served as the ultimate, unprecedented rising action, mathematically and physically accelerating the chase toward an inevitable, highly destructive conclusion. The authorities knew with absolute certainty that they were tracking an individual who completely lacked any biological mechanism for remorse, a predator who viewed her own escalating crimes not as a tragedy, but as a heavily documented performance for a digital audience. The absolute, undeniable climax of this highly public, cross-country terror campaign violently erupted on the side of a busy interstate highway in North Carolina, completely shattering the fugitives' desperate illusion of escape. The pursuing tactical teams received a critical, highly alarming dispatch indicating that Sean Ball had been discovered critically wounded in a local hospital parking lot, having suffered severe, life-threatening gunshot injuries directly to his face and neck. It became immediately, terrifyingly clear that Amanda, operating with absolute, cold-blooded pragmatism, had violently turned on her own accomplice, ruthlessly attempting to execute him when he became a logistical liability to her continued freedom. Armed with the precise location of this secondary shooting, highly armed state troopers and federal agents rapidly converged on the surrounding area, ultimately cornering Amanda Taylor near a commercial highway intersection and taking her into custody without any further catastrophic loss of life. When transported to the local police precinct and placed within the sterile, heavily monitored confines of an interrogation room, Amanda did not exhibit the slightest hint of panic, remorse, or typical criminal evasion. Instead, she provided a completely detached, chillingly calm, and highly comprehensive confession to the seasoned detectives. She looked directly into the recording camera and meticulously, clinically detailed the precise mechanics of the slaughter, explicitly describing how she forcefully drove the blade into Charles Taylor's chest, heavily emphasizing that she felt absolutely no hesitation or regret during the brutal physical execution. She arrogantly reiterated her deeply twisted justification, calmly explaining that her father-in-law fundamentally deserved to die for his alleged transgressions, treating the horrific act of patricide as nothing more than a necessary, logical transaction to balance the cosmic scales for her deceased husband. The investigating officers, completely hardened by years of violent crime, were profoundly disturbed by the pure, unadulterated emptiness in her eyes and the casual, conversational tone she utilized while describing the destruction of a human life. This recorded, incontrovertible interrogation served as the ultimate, insurmountable peak of the investigative timeline, permanently stripping away any potential legal defense of insanity or impulsive passion, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that her actions were the result of cold, calculated malice. The digital boasts had effectively culminated in a stark, undeniable physical reality, leaving the authorities with a pristine, airtight documentation of a deeply psychopathic killer who was immensely proud of her catastrophic handiwork. The subsequent judicial reckoning for Amanda Taylor was remarkably swift and highly definitive, completely bypassing the prolonged, theatrical legal maneuvers that frequently characterize high-profile murder trials. Presented with the insurmountable, completely unassailable mountain of digital evidence, the recovered murder weapon, and her own chilling, extensively detailed video confession, the state prosecution easily secured a rapid, unanimous conviction for first-degree premeditated murder. The presiding judicial authority in Montgomery County, explicitly emphasizing the exceptionally cruel, highly calculated nature of the brutal stabbing and the profoundly disturbing, remorseless social media exhibitionism that followed, delivered a mandatory, uncompromising sentence of life in a state penitentiary without the absolute possibility of parole. Sean Ball, who miraculously survived the severe gunshot wounds inflicted by his former obsession, formally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for his active role in facilitating the slaughter of Charles Taylor, receiving a substantial 60-year prison sentence that permanently effectively ended his freedom. The victim's surviving family members were forced to navigate a profound, agonizing grief, attempting to reconcile the horrific reality that their loved one was violently sacrificed to satisfy the deeply twisted, narcissistic urges of a woman they had once welcomed into their home. Amanda Taylor was permanently removed from civilized society, heavily remanded to the highly secure confines of the Flavanna Correctional Center for Women, where she will spend the absolute remainder of her natural life, entirely separated from the digital platforms she aggressively utilized to broadcast her malice. This absolute, permanent revocation of her liberty ensured that she could never again wield a weapon or a smartphone to orchestrate and publicize the destruction of another human being. The factual, meticulously documented record of this deeply unsettling case stands as a stark, modern testament to the terrifying reality that extreme psychological darkness can now be instantly amplified and celebrated on social media. fundamentally altering the way predators interact with the public. While Amanda Taylor utilized the internet to document her crime after the fact, the vast, anonymous landscape of the digital world can also be weaponized to actively hunt and lure completely unsuspecting victims into fatal traps. Moving away from the violent, publicized retaliation in Virginia, investigators in Pennsylvania would soon be confronted with a highly coordinated, incredibly dark partnership where the internet served as the primary hunting ground for a couple actively seeking to experience the ultimate, premeditated thrill of taking a stranger's life. Troy LaFerrara was a 42-year-old civil engineer residing in the quiet, historic borough of Port Trevorton, Pennsylvania, where he maintained a seemingly ordinary, respectable life alongside his wife of several years. Despite outward appearances of conventional domestic stability, Troy actively harbored hidden personal struggles and private indiscretions that ultimately led him to navigate the murky, unregulated depths of the internet in search of paid female companionship. On November 11, 2013, this covert digital pursuit tragically intersected with a highly dangerous, fundamentally disturbed newlywed couple living in the neighboring town of Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, setting the stage for a completely unprovoked, horrific slaughter. 18-year-old Miranda Barbour and her 22-year-old husband Alyssa Barbour had only been married for 3 weeks, having recently relocated from North Carolina. But their matrimonial bond was uniquely forged not through traditional affection, but through a shared, deeply psychopathic obsession with extreme violence and murder. Instead of planning a conventional honeymoon or building a normal foundation for their new life together, the young couple meticulously conspired to orchestrate a premeditated thrill kill, actively seeking to consummate their dark union by collaboratively taking the life of a completely unsuspecting stranger. To facilitate this diabolical, highly calculated objective, Miranda deliberately created a deceptive, alluring advertisement on the classifieds website Craigslist, offering female companionship in exchange for financial compensation, specifically designing the digital trap to attract isolated, vulnerable men who would be highly unlikely to disclose their whereabouts. Troy LaFerrara, seeking a temporary, transactional encounter, tragically responded to this very advertisement, willingly agreeing to meet the young woman at a local shopping mall parking lot without possessing the slightest comprehension of the lethal, coordinated ambush that awaited him. The vast, anonymous landscape of the internet, typically utilized for mundane commerce and social interaction, was thus aggressively weaponized by the Barbours as a highly efficient, heavily concealed hunting ground to fulfill their darkest, most depraved psychological impulses. This chilling, premeditated utilization of digital classifieds perfectly illustrates a terrifying modern reality where predators can cast a wide, invisible net into the community, waiting patiently for a target to voluntarily walk into a meticulously designed execution chamber. The seemingly peaceful, rural backdrop of central Pennsylvania remained completely oblivious to the lethal conspiracy, actively gestating within its borders, as the unsuspecting civil engineer drove toward a fatal rendezvous that had been ruthlessly engineered solely for the sadistic gratification of a deranged couple. The fragile, constructed illusion of safety within the local community was permanently eradicated the following morning when a resident of Sunbury, Pennsylvania, made a grim, deeply disturbing discovery while walking through a quiet, heavily shaded residential alleyway. Lying awkwardly discarded on the cold pavement, completely unresponsive and heavily soaked in coagulated blood, was the physically battered body of Troy LaFerrara, instantly prompting a frantic emergency dispatch to the local law enforcement authorities. First responding police officers and highly trained crime scene technicians rapidly secured the isolated perimeter, immediately recognizing that the sheer volume of biological evidence and the catastrophic nature of the fatal injuries pointed undeniably toward a highly aggressive, deeply personal homicide. A subsequent, meticulous forensic examination conducted by the county medical examiner officially documented the horrifying, overwhelming savagery of the physical assault, revealing that the 42-year-old victim had sustained 20 distinct, incredibly deep stab wounds aggressively targeting his neck, chest and back. Furthermore, the physical autopsy uncovered undeniable, severe ligature marks deeply compressed into the tissue of his neck, mathematically proving that La Ferrara had been violently strangled from behind, while simultaneously being subjected to a relentless barrage of blade strikes from the front. This terrifying, empirical evidence of a highly coordinated, dual-pronged attack instantly dispelled any preliminary law enforcement theories of a solitary robbery gone wrong, clearly indicating that the victim had been helplessly trapped and simultaneously assaulted by at least two highly motivated perpetrators, working in synchronized tandem. The physical location of the discarded body, situated miles away from the victim's own residence and utterly devoid of his personal identification or vehicle, heavily suggested that the alleyway was merely a secondary dumping ground, fundamentally establishing that the actual slaughter had occurred within a highly mobile, concealed environment. Every single drop of blood deliberately left at the scene served as a silent, agonizing testament to the absolute ferocity of an attack that fundamentally shattered the inherent trust required for a civilized society to function. This horrific, blood-soaked discovery served as the definitive inciting incident of the criminal investigation, instantly transitioning the quiet municipality into the active, high-stakes epicenter of a frantic, multi-jurisdictional homicide inquiry focused squarely on identifying the unknown, highly dangerous architects of this brutal overkill. The local detectives, confronted with a pristine, unidentified corpse and a complete absence of immediate eyewitnesses, were forced to rely heavily on advanced digital forensics to retrace the victim's final, fatal steps, entirely unaware that the digital trail would lead directly to a seemingly unremarkable teenage newlid. As the formal homicide investigation rapidly gained aggressive momentum, seasoned detectives successfully identified the deceased victim and immediately executed comprehensive search warrants to obtain his highly detailed cellular phone records, seeking the crucial digital breadcrumbs leading up to his execution. The pristine, undeniable telecommunications data provided a critical, case-altering breakthrough, revealing that Troy LaFerrara's very last communicative interaction was a series of text messages and phone calls exchanged with a specific mobile number directly registered to 18-year-old Miranda Barbour. Armed with this incontrovertible, digital connection, law enforcement officials swiftly located the young woman and her husband, Elit, bringing them into the sterile confines of the police precinct for a highly pressurized, meticulously documented interrogation regarding their knowledge of the deceased. Initially, Miranda and Elit adopted a highly defensive, deeply deceptive posture, aggressively weaving a fabricated, highly convoluted narrative claiming they had indeed met with the man to purchase a television, but asserting that he had left completely unharmed following the mundane transaction. When the seasoned investigators systematically dismantled this flimsy alibi by presenting undeniable, contradictory video surveillance footage from the local mall and highlighting glaring logical inconsistencies in their timeline, the Barbers seamlessly pivoted to a secondary, increasingly desperate fabrication. Miranda tearfully claimed that she had met LaFerrara for companionship, but that he suddenly became violently aggressive, allegedly attempting to sexually assault her within the confined space of her vehicle, which supposedly forced her to retrieve a concealed knife and stab him purely in a desperate act of self-defense. However, this manufactured narrative of spontaneous survival completely failed to account for the deep, undeniable ligature marks medically documented on the victim's neck, nor did it explain the massive, overwhelming overkill of 20 stab wounds that fundamentally defied the physical parameters of a simple defensive struggle. The investigating detectives relentlessly pressed the couple, meticulously isolating them in separate interrogation rooms to actively exploit their inconsistencies and slowly fracture the psychological bond that held their dark, premeditated secret together. The tension within the precinct reached an agonizing, suffocating peak as law enforcement technicians executing a concurrent search warrant on Elit Barbour's personal electronics uncovered deeply disturbing, undeniable internet search queries explicitly detailing how to easily remove blood from car upholstery and how to effectively strangle a human target. Every single lie the couple constructed was ruthlessly eradicated by the relentless accumulation of objective, scientific data, actively accelerating the investigation toward an inevitable, horrifying revelation that would completely shatter their fragile facade and expose the sheer, sadistic malice hiding beneath their youthful appearances. The absolute, irrefutable climax of this highly complex investigation violently erupted when the crushing weight of the overwhelming physical and digital evidence finally fractured Alyssa Barbour's psychological resolve, prompting him to abandon his wife's fabricated narratives and deliver a chilling, comprehensive confession. He completely dismantled the illusion of a botched robbery or a desperate act of self-defense, explicitly and clinically detailing the exact, premeditated mechanics of a highly coordinated thrill kill that the couple had actively fantasized about and meticulously planned for weeks. Alyssa calmly explained to the profoundly disturbed detectives that he had deliberately purchased a specialized hunting knife and a heavy cord specifically for the murder, subsequently hiding himself entirely under a dark blanket in the back seat of Miranda's SUV, while she drove to the mall to collect their unsuspecting Craigslist target. As Troy LaFerrara entered the passenger seat, completely oblivious to the lethal threat lurking mere inches behind his head, Miranda drove to a predetermined, highly isolated geographical location, eventually giving her husband a secret, pre-arranged verbal signal to violently initiate the execution. Following the signal, Alyssa aggressively lunged from beneath his concealment, violently wrapping the heavy cord tightly around LaFerrara's throat and forcefully pinning him against the seat, entirely incapacitating the older man while Miranda simultaneously drew her blade and relentlessly plunged it into his torso 20 times. This staggering, insurmountable documentary evidence of a highly organized, sadistic slaughter was rapidly followed by a deeply sensational, bizarre plot twist when Miranda, speaking directly to local media outlets from behind bars, arrogantly claimed that LaFerrara was merely her latest victim in a long, highly prolific career of serial murder. She casually asserted that she had actively participated in the brutal slaughter of at least 22 other individuals across various states, ranging from Alaska to North Carolina, allegedly operating as a highly trained assassin for a deeply entrenched, violent satanic cult. While the Federal Bureau of Investigation heavily scrutinized these massive, sprawling claims of serial murder and ultimately found absolutely no credible evidence to substantiate the existence of the other victims or the alleged cult, the highly publicized confession provided a terrifying, undeniable window into her deeply fractured, psychopathic mentality. Investigators were forced to carefully untangle the absolute reality of the single, proven murder from the massive, convoluted web of psychopathic fantasies she continuously broadcasted to anyone willing to effectively listen to her grandiosity. The absolute, undeniable clarity of the physical ambush within the vehicle completely obliterated any possible legal defense, leaving the authorities with a pristine, airtight documentation of a deeply psychopathic partnership that had successfully achieved its horrific goal of shared destruction. The subsequent legal trajectory of the Barbour's criminal case was heavily defined by the absolute, insurmountable mountain of forensic evidence and their own detailed, horrifyingly explicit confessions, completely eliminating the necessity for a prolonged, highly contentious jury trial. Recognizing the absolute futility of attempting to defend against the irrefutable, scientifically documented mechanics of this synchronized ambush, both Miranda and Alyssa Barbour ultimately chose to formally plead guilty to the severe, unyielding charge of second-degree murder, a strategic, highly calculated legal maneuver specifically designed to avoid the very real possibility of receiving the death penalty. During the profoundly somber, emotionally devastating sentencing hearing, the presiding judicial authority explicitly emphasized the exceptionally cruel, highly calculated nature of the digital lure and the profound, chilling lack of human empathy required to slaughter a complete stranger simply for matrimonial bonding. The judge delivered the maximum permissible sentence, allowable under the plea agreement, condemning both 18-year-old Miranda and 22-year-old Alyssa to serve the absolute remainder of their natural lives in maximum security state penitentiaries without the slightest possibility of ever achieving parole. They were permanently, heavily removed from civilized society, entirely stripped of their liberty and remanded to separate, highly monitored correctional institutions, guaranteeing that their deeply destructive, dark partnership was definitively and irreversibly severed forever. The victim's surviving family members, forced to navigate the profound, agonizing reality that their loved one was violently sacrificed to satisfy the deeply twisted, narcissistic urges of two deranged youths, found a small measure of true, unyielding justice in the permanence of the life sentences. The factual, meticulously documented record of this specific case stands as a permanent, terrifying testament to the chilling reality that the internet can serve as a highly effective hunting ground for those who wish to transform their darkest, most violent fantasies into bloody reality. Yet, while the Barbers utilized a digital trap to snare a completely unknown victim for a shared thrill, the chilling, methodical capacity to execute a human being can also stem from a lifelong, deeply cultivated obsession with the very literature and history of serial murder itself. The fundamental, deeply unsettling reality of this case highlights the terrifying vulnerability inherent in modern digital interactions, where an anonymous advertisement can seamlessly transition into a fatal, inescapable physical trap, journeying from the cold, blood-stained alleyways of Pennsylvania to the vast, sprawling landscapes of Western Australia. Investigators would soon uncover a horrifying scenario where a seemingly ordinary retail manager actively utilized her encyclopedic knowledge of notorious killers to draft and ultimately execute her very own diabolical bucket list. Aaron Pagich was a gentle, deeply trusting 18-year-old man living in the southern suburbs of Perth, Western Australia, who navigated the world through the unique lens of autism spectrum disorder, finding immense joy and comfort in the predictable routines of computer software, digital gaming, and collecting compact discs. His inherent innocence and profound vulnerability made him a beloved figure among his family and support network, who carefully guided him through a society that could often be overwhelming and complex for a neurodivergent individual. Tragically, this sheltered, fundamentally peaceful existence was targeted by 25-year-old Jemma Lilley, a British expatriate and seemingly ordinary local supermarket manager whose outward professional facade completely masked a deeply disturbing, lifelong psychological obsession with the macabre history of serial murder. Lilley did not merely consume true crime media as a passive observer. She aggressively integrated it into her core identity, dedicating her free time to authoring a gruesome, unpublished manuscript about a fictional serial killer she named SOS, actively adopting this very persona in her daily life and online communications. She shared a nondescript, suburban house in the neighborhood of Aurelia with 43-year-old Trudy Lennon, a mother and active participant in the local bondage and discipline community who seamlessly adopted a highly submissive, dangerously compliant role to Lilley's increasingly dominant, homicidal ideations. The psychological dynamic between the two women created a profoundly toxic, lethal feedback loop, where Lilley's theoretical fantasies of extreme violence were actively encouraged, validated, and ultimately weaponized by Lennon's desperate desire to please her younger, dominant roommate. The most terrifying, undeniably premeditated aspect of Lilley's psychological landscape was her frequently vocalized, meticulously documented bucket list, an inventory of life goals that prominently and exclusively featured the explicit desire to successfully execute a human being before she reached her 26th birthday. Aaron Pagich tragically intersected with this dark, festering conspiracy simply because he was a known, casual acquaintance of Trudy Lennon, making him the perfect, easily manipulated target for a predator seeking a victim who would not immediately suspect malice. The quiet, entirely unremarkable physical structure of the Aurelia property, situated in a standard Australian residential development, was secretly transforming into the meticulously prepared staging ground for a highly calculated, completely unprovoked slaughter. This terrifying convergence of profound vulnerability and calculated, psychopathic ambition perfectly established the grim foundation for a murder that would completely devastate a tight-knit family and permanently shatter the suburban tranquility of Western Australia. The catastrophic, irreversible activation of Lilley's diabolical plan officially commenced on the crisp, unremarkable morning of June 13, 2016, when Aaron confidently left his residential care home, informing his housemates that he was traveling to meet a friend to download some new computer software and play video games. This seemingly mundane, entirely routine technological errand perfectly aligned with his established interests, preventing his immediate caretakers from harboring any initial, preventative suspicions regarding his scheduled itinerary or his physical safety. Aaron traveled via public transportation to a bustling, heavily monitored local shopping center in the suburb of Kwinana, where he was formally intercepted by Trudy Lennon and Jemma Lilley, who had deliberately utilized the false pretense of computer assistance to successfully lure him away from the safety of his familiar environment. CCTV cameras seamlessly captured the exact, chilling moment the trusting teenager willingly entered the passenger seat of their vehicle. A completely voluntary action rooted entirely in his fundamental inability to recognize the lethal deception actively masquerading as friendship. When the late afternoon slowly transitioned into evening, and Aaron completely failed to return to his care facility, answer his mobile phone, or log onto his highly frequented online gaming accounts, his family and caretakers immediately recognized a profound, life-threatening deviation from his rigid daily routines. The intense, unspoken panic rapidly materialized into a formal missing persons report filed with the Western Australian Police Force, immediately triggering a localized search effort that initially focused on standard inquiries at local hospitals, transit hubs, and known recreational hangouts. However, seasoned investigators swiftly realized that Aaron's profound dependency and strict adherence to his schedules made a voluntary disappearance mathematically impossible, instantly elevating the urgency of the situation and transitioning the departmental focus from a routine search into a highly suspicious, potentially criminal investigation. The seemingly harmless invitation to install software served as the definitive, undeniable inciting incident of the case, marking the absolute point of no return where a vulnerable teenager was physically absorbed into the dark, concealed reality of his predators. As the first several days agonizingly passed without a single shred of credible communication or a confirmed physical sighting, the local police force began to heavily rely on the sprawling, objective network of digital surveillance to reconstruct his final, documented movements. The quiet, unassuming streets of Perth were rapidly transforming into the active epicenter of a desperate, high-stakes hunt, heavily driven by the chilling realization that the missing young man had likely been led directly into an inescapable, meticulously planned trap. As the formal missing persons investigation aggressively expanded, specialized digital forensics teams and seasoned detectives meticulously traced Aaron's final known technological footprint directly to the Kwinana shopping precinct, where they methodically reviewed hours of high-definition security footage to isolate his specific movements. The pristine, undeniable video evidence provided a critical, case-altering breakthrough, clearly depicting Aaron peacefully interacting with Trudy Lennon and subsequently getting into a red vehicle, physically registered to Jemma Lilley, providing law enforcement with their first concrete, actionable targets. Armed with this incontrovertible visual connection, detectives immediately located the two women and brought them in for questioning, triggering a highly pressurized, completely documented interaction where Lilley and Lennon aggressively wove a fabricated, highly coordinated narrative. They smoothly acknowledged meeting Aaron at the shopping center, but vehemently insisted they had merely provided him with a brief ride, completely fabricating a story that they had safely dropped him off at a different local intersection shortly afterward, entirely unharmed. However, seasoned investigators immediately detected severe, glaring inconsistencies in their shared timeline, heavily noting Lilley's deeply unsettling, emotionally detached demeanor and Lennon's highly erratic, nervous physical energy, which completely contradicted the natural behavior of innocent witnesses. Recognizing the absolute necessity for empirical physical evidence to pierce this shared architecture of deception, law enforcement officials swiftly secured and executed a comprehensive search warrant on the Aurelia residence, deploying heavily equipped forensic crime scene technicians to meticulously dissect the property. The interior of the home revealed a deeply disturbing, undeniably psychopathic environment, entirely saturated with specialized knives. Literature heavily detailing the histories of notorious serial killers and highly suspect, aggressively cleaned areas that heavily suggested the recent, profound destruction of biological evidence. Yet, the most alarming, visually jarring discovery was situated not within the sterile confines of the house, but outside in the rear garden, where detectives observed a massive, freshly poured, highly amateurish concrete slab that was hastily and haphazardly concealed beneath a large tarpaulin and scattered ceramic tiles. The investigative tension reached an agonizing, suffocating peak when detectives cross-referenced the hardware store receipts found within the home, mathematically proving that the immense quantities of cement and hydrochloric acid had been explicitly purchased in the immediate, frantic days directly following Aaron's disappearance. Every single lie the two women had constructed was rapidly disintegrating under the relentless, objective accumulation of physical and logistical data, aggressively accelerating the investigation toward an inevitable, horrific revelation hiding directly beneath the surface of their own backyard. The absolute irrefutable climax of the investigation violently erupted on the morning of June 21, 2016, when the Western Australian Police Force deployed heavy industrial machinery, pneumatic jackhammers, and specialized forensic exhumation teams to completely dismantle the highly suspicious concrete slab situated in the Aurelia Garden. As the thick, unyielding layers of cement were systematically broken apart and carefully removed, the detectives made the grim, profoundly devastating discovery they had methodically anticipated: the heavily concealed, violently brutalized remains of 18-year-old Aaron Pagich, tightly wrapped in a sealed plastic tarpaulin. The subsequent, meticulous forensic autopsy officially documented the sheer, staggering brutality of the premeditated execution, revealing that the teenager had sustained multiple, incredibly deep stab wounds aggressively targeting his chest and neck, injuries designed specifically to cause rapid, catastrophic blood loss. Furthermore, the medical examiner uncovered undeniable physical evidence that Aaron had been viciously, relentlessly strangled with a heavy cord, a dual-pronged, highly coordinated method of slaughter that perfectly, mathematically mirrored the exact fictional violence Lilley had extensively detailed in her own, unpublished serial killer manuscript. Confronted directly with the overwhelming, insurmountable reality of the exhumed body, the psychological alliance between the two killers instantly and violently fractured, transforming the police interrogation rooms into a chaotic theater of mutual blame, where each woman desperately attempted to assign the physical act of the murder to the other. The true, staggering magnitude of Lilley's psychopathic arrogance was fully exposed when detectives uncovered highly incriminating, deeply disturbing text messages she had sent immediately following the slaughter, explicitly expressing a profound, sadistic empowerment and formally boasting that she had successfully completed her lifelong bucket list. She had cold-bloodedly utilized the trusting teenager simply as a disposable prop to fulfill her deeply entrenched delusions of grandeur, treating the horrific destruction of a human life as nothing more than a morbid, highly celebrated personal milestone. The physical recovery of the body completely obliterated any remaining, fragile illusions of a missing person case or a tragic accident, providing the state prosecution with the airtight, irrefutable physical corroboration required to charge both women with first-degree, premeditated murder. The investigation had seamlessly transitioned from a frantic search for a lost boy into a stark, undeniable documentation of a meticulously planned thrill kill, explicitly orchestrated by a woman who sought to elevate herself from a reader of true crime into an active, celebrated participant in its darkest chapters. The highly publicized judicial reckoning for Jemma Lilley and Trudy Lennon formally commenced in late 2017 within the austere, highly guarded confines of the Supreme Court of Western Australia, serving as a deeply harrowing public exhibition of the extreme, unadulterated cruelty that had transpired within the Aurelia residence. Throughout the extensive, emotionally devastating trial proceedings, the two defendants continuously and aggressively turned on one another, each desperately deploying highly technical legal arguments and shifting narratives in a futile attempt to minimize their individual culpability in the physical execution of the teenager. However, the state prosecution executed a flawless, scientifically impenetrable masterclass in evidentiary presentation, meticulously weaving together the pristine CCTV footage, the recovered hardware store receipts, the deeply disturbing digital communications, and the undeniable reality of the concrete tomb into a mathematically absolute timeline of premeditated slaughter. The jury, presented with the overwhelming, insurmountable facts of the calculated lure, the brutal overkill, and the subsequent, highly organized attempt to permanently entomb the victim, deliberated for only a short period before returning definitive, unanimous verdicts, finding both women entirely guilty of first-degree murder. The presiding judicial authority, explicitly emphasizing the exceptionally cruel, highly calculated nature of the trap and the profound, chilling psychopathy required to slaughter a vulnerable, trusting individual purely for the thrill of the experience, delivered the harshest penalties allowable under state law. Both Jemma Lilley and Trudy Lennon were decisively sentenced to life in a maximum security state penitentiary, with a stringent, mandatory minimum requirement that they serve at least 28 continuous years behind bars before even being legally eligible to petition for supervised parole. They were permanently, heavily removed from civilized Australian society, entirely stripped of their liberty, and remanded to highly secure correctional facilities, effectively guaranteeing that Lilley's twisted desire for serial killer notoriety resulted only in the bleak, unyielding reality of permanent institutional confinement. Aaron Pagich's devastated family was left to navigate a profound, agonizing grief, attempting to reconcile the horrific reality that their beloved son was violently sacrificed simply to satisfy the deeply twisted, narcissistic fantasies of a woman who viewed human life as entirely expendable. The factual, meticulously documented record of this specific case stands as a stark, permanent testament to the extreme dangers of unchecked, obsessive homicidal ideation, bringing our exhaustive examination of these diabolical minds to its final, unavoidable conclusion. The meticulous untangling of these complex, deeply sinister fictions ultimately leads us to a broader, undeniable realization regarding the sheer capacity for human malice and the relentless, scientific pursuit required to expose it. The exhaustive documentation of these 10 meticulously orchestrated crimes reveals a chilling reality, where the most profound human malice hides, flawlessly behind the masks of grieving widows, devoted mothers, and seemingly ordinary neighbors, leaving us to inevitably question how many other perfect facades in our own lives are actively concealing a lethal, premeditated intent, while the unyielding, procedural vigilance of forensic science successfully dismantled these specific architectures of deception to secure a measure of factual justice. The fundamental psychological darkness that birthed these diabolical plans remains an unsolvable, terrifying fixture of the human condition. Thank you for watching, and for joining me in the relentless pursuit of the objective truth.